It's 2025, a new year, and the perfect time to turn your business dreams into reality. Maybe you've been tossing around a great idea, but haven't acted yet. Well, Shopify is how you're going to make it happen. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and make your first sale. With thousands of customizable templates, you don't need coding or design skills. Just drag, drop, and go. Plus, Shopify's social media tools help you connect all your channels and create shoppable posts so you can sell everywhere your customers scroll. Managing your business is easy too. From shipping to taxes to payments, Shopify handles the details on a single dashboard, letting you focus on what really matters: growing your business. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/audio.
Every idea starts with a problem. Warby Parker's was simple. Glasses are too expensive. So they set out to change that. By designing glasses in-house and selling directly to customers, they're able to offer prescription eyewear that's expertly crafted and unexpectedly affordable. Warby Parker glasses are made from premium materials like impact-resistant polycarbonate and custom acetate. And they start at just $95, including prescription lenses. Get glasses made from the good stuff. Stop by a Warby Parker store near you.
It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting, either through my website, emailrevealer.com, or just contact me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Okay, our guest today is David Whelan. Okay, and he's the author of the upcoming book called Give Me Some Truth, The Assassination of John Lennon. And you want to check out his Substack. You go to substack.com at David Whelan, Whelan, and he's written some articles there. As a matter of fact, I came into contact with him today. Well, last second, we just threw this interview together really quickly because he mentioned me in one of his articles called Seeing Double, where there are two Mark David Chapmans. And that's been one of my theories. And you can check him out at Twitter at Lennon Murder. You can check him out at YouTube at Assassination of Lennon, and also too on Instagram at Assassination of Lennon. So, Mr. David Whelan, are you there?
I'm there. Hi, Ed. How you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for the last second. You just jumped right on board. Let's do a show. And David was on the phone. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. So tell the audience, who is David Whelan?
Well, I'm a TV producer, mostly by trade. I was born in London, North London. Grew up around Camden Town. Don't know if you've ever been to the wonderful Camden Town. But it's a great place to grow up. It was very vibrant in the 70s and 80s. Big Irish community. I have an Irish background in my family. Very lucky. At 17, I got a job working for Thames Television, which is probably the biggest TV station in London. So, totally fluked my way into there at 17. And that was 40 years ago, and I've still been working in TV ever since. So that was a real lucky break. With regards to Lennon and how I got to here, I've worked in news before. I was a news researcher at Thames for many years, met my wife in the newsroom. And I've always been interested in news, but recently I kind of moved away and did a lot of work in sport. But my big, how can I put it, red pill moment was Oliver Stone's JFK film in 1991, I believe. And like everyone else, I bought up until that film, or like a lot of people up until that film, I bought the story that Lee Harvey Oswald was definitely the lone nut, and there was nothing to see there. And that film, I remember going in there to see it and thinking it was just a biography of JFK. And having Irish family, JFK is a big part of their culture, and he was always on a lot of walls in my sort of aunties and uncles' home back in Ireland. So when I went in there and saw that film, it's just the impact on me was seismic. It was like, oh my God, but we get lied to.
Yeah, not what you were expecting, right? Not what you were expecting at all.
Not at all. It just totally blew me away. I was like, oh my goodness, we sometimes we get lied to. Often we get lied to. And after that, I went into it and started to read lots of JFK books. So it's always been a big interest of mine. And of course, if you read some JFK books, you'll kind of read RFK books and MLK books, and and they're all connected. I think these 1960s murders or assassinations, should we say? And I never really gave John Lennon much thought, to be honest with you. I was only 14 when he died, and to be honest with you, in 1980, I was more interested in Blondie and the Jam and stuff like that. I wasn't Lennon. The Beatles were a long time ago, in 1980 for me, and he was just this kind of old rocker who was coming out with some rather dull rock and roll stuff. I'm not a big fan of starting over and double fantasy, to be honest with you. So I had no idea who he was when he died, when he was assassinated, and in 1980. And for 40 years, Ed, I believed what everyone else believed, that there was this another lone nut who shot John in the back. He admitted it at the scene. He was thrown quickly into jail, and he's sitting in jail right now, and that's where he should be. And I never gave it another thought.
Yeah, something about Chapman, Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah, there's all that. There was some strange stuff, like he got a book out and started reading it. The guy must be crazy. And what changed it for me was lockdown. I had lots of projects on the go leading up to lockdown. And when lockdown occurred, it was wonderful because I could kind of park them all to one side and just spend a few weeks and months just recalibrating, really resetting my mind and just sort of thinking about stuff that I hadn't thought about for a while. It was kind of nice to get off the ride, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And, just look at the scenery. And what happened was I was just walking the dog and I was listening to a podcast. I don't know if you know the podcast Black Ops Radio.
Sure.
Which mainly deals with the JFK assassination. So it just goes to show what JFK geek I am. And I was listening to that in the spring of 2020, and someone mentioned on that show that the doorman at the Dakota might have been pages of notes, and then it got to 10 pages, then it got to 50 pages. And then I started to see more and more anomalies. And I just thought, this just doesn't make sense. And because it was lockdown and I had nothing to do for many months, I just kept going. And I kept, researching. And then eventually I started to ring people and talk to people. And that's when it really started to unfold. And 3 years later, here I am.
I'm looking at your Substack here, and you got about 15 articles on here.
Yeah.
And one of them is about Paul Goresh, the young photographer, right? Did you get a chance? He recently passed away. Did you get a chance to talk to him?
No, I didn't get a chance to talk to Paul. But I've spoken to lots of people who knew him. Okay. And I know a fair bit about Paul now. And if you speak to people, obviously, who knew the Lennons, they've got opinions on Paul as well. Paul is a very interesting microcosm of how the Lennon murder has been packaged in a certain way. But when you actually dig a little bit dig a bit further and look a bit closer, you see it's not really the reality of what we've been sold. And Goresh is a classic example of that. He's sold as a guy, this kind of happy-go-lucky guy who loved John Lennon and kind of cheekily, blagged his way into John's apartment and then became John's best friend. And, it's kind of done in a kind of Mills and Boone romantic kind of way. But the truth, when you talk to people who were in the Dakota at the time and were dealing with Goresh, is Lennon found Goresh deeply irritating. And he pretty much saw him as a stalker, as did a lot of people in the Dakota. And Goresh was a serious Beatles pop culture memorabilia collector. And as far as I'm concerned, I think he was there more for getting John's pictures to kind of use as a collection and potentially as a money-making scheme than as a super fan. So for me, as I call him in the article, I think he was more of a super leech than a super fan.
And Goresh,
interesting guy.
Yeah, he's the one who got that last photograph of Lennon and Chapman together holding the album, right?
He did. Have you read the article?
I haven't had a chance to read your article, no. But looking into Mr. Goresh, and I tried to get him on this show many times, okay, because he was portrayed as this photographer, like you said, fan. But when you read some of his interviews, he was a security guard who dreamed of becoming a police officer. But then his career went into photography because people like the Beach Boys wanted him to come and take pictures of them after he took pictures of the dead John Lennon, which I found very interesting.
Very interesting. I think, he was also a repo man. So if you're thinking, 1970s New York, he was a television repo man at that. So you can imagine some of the places Big Paul had to go into to get the TVs back or to get some cash. So you had to be fairly handy to do that. That's not something for the meek and mild. But what's interesting about Paul is, that shot he got of Chapman, he portrays it as something that he kind of just luckily got, and he really didn't know what he was getting. But he actually brought, I was very lucky to get hold of the police vouchers and all the police notebooks, which again, I'll talk in a little while to you about how I got all those. But in one of those vouchers, there's a voucher from Paul Goresh where he hands in a double fantasy album for Chapman's prints to the NYPD. Now, you've got to ask yourself the question, why has Paul Goresh got his own copy of Double Fantasy, and why is he handing it in with Chapman's prints on?
At your job, do you ever have to deal with a nose roller? How about a snub pulley? Well, if you're installing a new conveyor belt system, dealing with the different components can sound like you're speaking a foreign language. Luckily, you've got a team ready to help. Grainger's technical product specialists are fluent in maintenance, repair, and operations. So whenever you want to talk shop, just reach out. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Chapman had his own copy that was signed. So you start to think, did Goresh bring a few copies of Double Fantasy? And was he more aware of getting that shot than perhaps we know? It just seemed very fortuitous that one of the world's most prominent Beatles memorabilia guys just happens to be there with his copy of Double Fantasy and just happens to get the photo of a lifetime, an iconic Zapruder-like photo that put Chapman in a place that, the NYPD wanted to put him in. So I'm not saying that he was part of some kind of conspiracy, but you do have to ask a lot of questions about Paul Goresh. He's not, I think, what he was portrayed as being, for sure. He's a very interesting sidebar in the John Lennon murder story, for sure.
Yeah, right. They all seem to be. And like you mentioned, Padermo, was at the Bay of Pigs. That's pretty much been established.
Well, no, I disagree with that.
Oh, really? Go ahead.
So, sorry, I don't. I mean, I did believe that for a long while.
Okay.
And I researched. That was one of the first things I researched was Padermo, because as I'm sure you know, that's the thing. If you put John Lennon assassination conspiracy, Padermo's name comes up.
Right.
Everywhere, and the background of that is as I know you know, for 7 years, from 1980 to 1987, no one knew who the Padermo's name was. No one knew who the doorman was. It was just a guy that was almost airbrushed out of history, which is strange when you consider Padermo was, the main witness, or should have been the main witness. So why we never got to know the guy's name until 1987 was very strange. But he turned up in a People magazine article by the journalist Jim Gaines. And Jim revealed it in 1987. And Jim, he wrote a line somewhere it said something along the lines of, the anti-Castro far-right Cuban, not sure if he said far-right, I think he said anti-Castro Cuban spoke to Mark Chapman about Castro, the Bay of Pigs, and the JFK assassination. So you can imagine when someone read that, and they went, okay, anti-Castro, Cuban, Bay of Pigs, JFK. And then, of course, when people did some research in 1987, pre-internet, so it can't have been easy, they realized that there was a Bay of Pigs operative at that particular landing in 1961 who was called Jose Padermo. And what's even more interesting than that is that particular Jose Padermo, let's call him Bay of Pigs Jose Padermo, was a very serious individual who was a leader of a group called Operation 40, which was a group of basically really, it's like the kind of A-team on steroids, a bunch of far-right Cuban assassins who were trained by the CIA to go in after the Bay of Pigs invasion and kind of sweep up anybody that wasn't kind of on board for the new regime. So these were serious individuals, and this Jose Padermo was leading them. So you can only imagine how serious this guy was. So if this was the guy that was working the door at the Dakota when John Lennon was assassinated, that would be an incredible coincidence, and it would be very disturbing if it was true. So the first thing I did was I needed to establish just who this Jose Padermo was. And of course, we didn't hear his name for 7 years until 87. But also, there's another interesting point about Dakota Jose, let's call him that, is we don't have his witness testimony, which is very strange because a guy called Jack Jones wrote a book about Chapman in 92. And Jack managed through FOIs to get a lot of witness testimony from the DA's office. And he pretty much got everyone. There's a few gaps that I've now thankfully filled in. But the one that he didn't get was Jose Padermo. Now, I contacted Kim Hogreff at the New York District Attorney's Office, who was the assistant DA at the time, and he was the guy leading the case. And I'm sure everyone who knows the case will know Kim. He's pretty much been on every single Lennon TV documentary since the dawn of time. Kim always gets himself on there. And Kim said to me, confirmed to me, that the DA's office, as you would expect, interviewed Jose as a witness, as an important witness. But he wouldn't reveal to me why that statement hadn't been revealed to the public. So there's still questions to ask about Dakota Jose. But as far as I can find out, Ed, is Dakota Jose was born in 1934 and he died in 2010. And he started working at the Dakota from 1969, and he kept on working there after Lennon's assassination until 1994. So Bay of Pigs Padermo was born in 1912. We're pretty sure about that. Now, according to John, this is where it gets a bit mysterious. According to Frank Sturgis, the Watergate plumber who worked with Padermo after the Bay of Pigs on various operations, Frank said that Bay of Pigs Jose died in 1973. But anyone who knows Frank Sturgis's history, he was famous for telling, as we say over here in the UK, pork pies. He used to like a lie. He was a bit uneconomical, or should I say, he just basically, every single second sentence that came out of Frank's mouth was a lie. But, he said 73, so we'll go with it. And most people did go with it, that Bay of Pigs died in 73. But then I saw an article in 1989, and I think it was the LA Times, and it was an obituary of a Bay of Pigs commander. And in it, a certain Jose Padermo gave a statement saying how wonderful this commander was. So someone called Jose Padermo, who fought at the Bay of Pigs, was still alive in 1989, which throws into doubt what Frank Sturgis said in 1973. So the Padermo story it's not quite there yet. I can't say categorically that Bay of Pigs Padermo wasn't Dakota Jose Padermo, but I'm pretty certain that he's not that guy. And you've also got to kind of wonder as well, Ed, would a guy that serious, a trained assassin who was in charge of trained assassins, would he want to work the door at the Dakota from 1969 to 1994? That's a long time to open cars for people and open doors and say good evening. I just can't see Bay of Pigs Padermo wanting to do that.
Well, okay, so then you're saying your thinking is clear that the Jose Padermo doorman was not CIA.
95%. Well, yeah. He might have been working for the intelligence agencies, and there's a lot of questions
it's not the same one.
To ask. It's not the Bay of Pigs Padermo. No.
Gotcha.
I'm 95% certain.
That's very interesting. But by the way, too, the doormen, New York City doormen at that period of time, were a little bit more sophisticated than just opening doors and saying nodding hello. A little security work, a lot of,
Yeah, I don't want to put them down. I don't want to put them down. I'm sure they had a lot more. Well, security should have been built into Jose Padermo's job description. And I think one question we do need to ask Dakota Jose Padermo, we can't ask him, he's dead now, but if we could, is why weren't you doing your job as a security guy that night?
Very interesting. Yeah, it's a good question. Now, and plus, you've heard other people say that, he started working the night before, and it was only
I tell you where that came from, because I've spoken to everyone. I've spoken to Joseph Manny, the lift operator. I've spoken to the concierge, Jay Hastings. I've spoken to the cops who turned up on the scene. So I've got a pretty good idea where that story came from. What happened was Jose was At that time, he had very bad problems with his circulation in his legs. And up until the night of the murder, he was working inside the concierge's office because he couldn't stand up very well at that particular point in time. But that night, rather suspiciously, Dakota Jose said to Jay Hastings, it was quite a warm night by all accounts. He said to Jay, it's a warm night. I've been stuck in this office for weeks. He didn't have very good English, apparently, so he wasn't doing much in that back office. And he asked Jay if he could go outside that night and work the door that night to take in the fresh air, which is slightly suspicious when you consider he wasn't doing that for a few weeks leading up to that point. So that meant that night he was there to witness the events. And I think that does cast a very suspicious eye on Dakota Jose Perdomo. And, of course, what happened after the event was we do know he was taken to the police station. I've got that confirmed. So not only did the DA take a statement, the NYPD took a statement as well back at the 20th precinct. And the next day, on the 9th of December, Jose said he couldn't work the door anymore. And he just stayed in the back office and stayed down in the basement for the rest of his time work for the next 14 years at Dakota. So he made sure that he was working the door that night, which is suspicious in itself. And then he made sure after the murder that when the whole world's media was trained on those gates, which it was for many days, you never got to see Jose's face. So I do find that very suspicious, and I think there is a lot of questions that Dakota Jose still has to answer.
Now, the first time the name Jose Perdomo jumped into my radar, it was an article. The internet was fairly new still. As a matter of fact, Facebook was brand new. And there was a fellow who wrote an article. He was a marijuana advocate who tried to portray himself as was part of the Yippies on Lower East Side. And I saw this article. He mentioned Jose Perdomo, and I created a Facebook profile for myself so I could contact him. That's why I created Facebook. And he told me this whole story about Jose Perdomo being CIA. Are you familiar with that author?
I'm not, but he almost certainly got his lead from that 1987 Jim Gaines People magazine, because if you read that in 87 and you saw the words anti-Castro, JFK, Cuba, Bay of Pigs, which, Jim Gaines made sure he put all those words in there. That was just massive red flags for any conspiracy theorist to go off and put those two things together. And there was a Jose Perdomo who was a main player at the Bay of Pigs. So I get it, but it's actually quite a popular name in Cuba, Jose Perdomo. There's many Jose Perdomos. And if you go on a Bay of Pigs, sort of soldiers tribute site, there's 3 or 4 of them there listed, not just Jose Sanginas Perdomo, who was the leader of Op 40. There's other Jose Perdomos as well. There's a Jose Bacallo Perdomo, who many people often use his photo as the kind of as the legitimate Jose. But actually, funny enough, we do now have a proper photo of Jose Perdomo from the Dakota, which we've not had for many, in fact, we've never had it. What happened was once I came out and broke the story to the media last month, a lovely guy from Chile contacted me and sent me a picture that was on a South American website. So if you go to my Instagram, you can now finally see the real face of Dakota Jose Perdomo. We finally got his face, which is great.
Excellent. Now, the reason we're talking today is because you contacted me today on Twitter and says, "Hey Ed, you're mentioned in one of my articles about your experience on Bleecker Street that weekend." Now, one of the reasons why I've questioned my own memory and my own experience, okay, you doubt yourself,
Sure.
And by the way, this had a huge effect in my life. The regret, hey, man, maybe I could have put a stop to this. Because a lot of guys, if they were acting up like Chapman was acting up that day, would have got his butt kicked really badly
sure.
in that doorway. The other people had. But he just got away. Now, but one of the reasons that's caused me to question my memory is I first heard about Perdomo through this fellow who was this marijuana advocate who kind of tried to portray himself as one of the Yippies. And then later on I asked about him, did anybody hear about this guy? And then this guy has vanished off the face of the earth.
Okay.
This guy, and he's the one who confirmed for me the cab driver was dropped Chapman off in that area in the village. We thought perhaps to buy marijuana at Yippie headquarters. Let me real quick tell you my experience that day.
No, please do.
Yeah, on Bleecker Street. Now, I went to high school in St. George, which was very close to Manhattan on Staten Island. And I would often take the ferry after school into Manhattan, hang out at Yippie headquarters in Washington Square Park and Lower East Side, that area. And one day, I was down there, Yippie headquarters, and it was very unusual because there was only a couple of guys in there who I knew, and there were this other group. One was the fellow that I believe was Chapman. He had this duffel bag, and he had like a black pea coat or an army coat, something like that. I think it was a black pea coat.
Right.
And then he had there was some young college kids with him that definitely weren't street-type anarchists. By the way, you called us socialists. The Yippies were anarchists in those days.
Big difference, big difference.
A couple of young ladies and a young man that were like college-age kids. They didn't seem to fit in with, they had just recently met each other, this group, Chapman and these other three. But they were out of place in Yippie headquarters, and they were being held in the outer reception area. Okay, right. Which was like a desk and a 200-year-old couch with urine stains. There was like marijuana everywhere, burns, and they were kept in that area out in front.
Right. They didn't get access to the inner.
No, they weren't behind the wall where I went to hide when everyone started leaving. Okay. And the thing was, they were especially the Chapman character was acting very agitated, and he kept saying, they were talking back and forth. I told you off the air, he kept mentioning that he was from Hawaii, he was very cold, he wasn't used to the weather, which later on, we heard those quotes later on too from the other Chapman.
Yeah, we did.
And then ultimately, other guys who I knew from Yippie headquarters were like freaked out by this guy, and they left me alone with this guy and these two other people. I think even the other ones left too. And at one point, it was just me and Chapman all by ourselves in this building.
Wow. And this what would have been Saturday the 6th?
That's it could have been.
Friday the 6th, sorry.
Either Friday or Saturday, okay? Most likely it would have been a Friday when I would have left school to go there, but I would go there on Saturdays too. And finally, I confronted him. I was the last one in there. I was hiding behind the wall, with the living room area. And finally, I came out and I says, "Look, man, what are you doing here? What do you want?" And he kept going into this duffel bag saying, "I have audio tapes for Aaron K. that I want to give to Aaron K., the Yippie Pie Man." But he would,
weird.
Yeah, and he would rustle around in this bag and come out with nothing over and over. So finally, I mustered up the courage, and I says, "Look, dude, you got to get out of here. You got to go." Okay, and he left, and everyone else had taken off. No one wanted any part of this guy. That was my experience.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Now, he never had any contact with Aaron K. He never had any contact with anybody else, as far as only the other people got nervous and left, and these young tourist types that were hanging out with him.
Right. That is really interesting. I mean, what I got from my Mark Snyder interview, and Mark Snyder, just to give people the background, is the taxi driver who famously said he had Chapman in the back of his cab, or in the front of his cab. I think he was in the front of his cab. And Chapman offered him some cocaine, which turned out not to be cocaine. And Chapman was ranting about working with the Beatles, and he was ranting about working with the Rolling Stones. And he was the exact same agitated guy that you described. And what happened was Snyder dropped Chapman off, or the guy he thought was Chapman, to 3 different locations, 2 locations before the final location, which was Bleecker Street, which is the exact location where you saw Mark Chapman. So it was almost certainly the same Mark Chapman that you both saw. It had to be. The coincidence is, who else could it have been? You must have both encountered the same guy. And of course, famously, James Taylor, the singer James Taylor, said that he encountered an agitated Mark Chapman. I think he said on the day of the murder, so that would have been on the 8th of December. And he said he got accosted very famously in a subway. But here's where it gets interesting, because Mark Chapman, what happened was Mark Snyder, after he gave up his taxi driving sort of gig, he was very young and he was just using that to get money to get himself through law school. He became an attorney, and he bumped into Mark Chapman's lawyer in around about 1982 time. And Jonathan Marks was still representing Mark Chapman at that time. Obviously, Chapman was in prison. And Snyder went up to Chapman's lawyer, Jonathan Marks, and said, "Can you ask Mark if he remembers being in my taxi and us driving around town?" So Mark said, "Yeah, sure, I'll ask Mark." And then a few days later, Snyder met Jonathan Marks again and said, "Did you just talk to Chapman about our experience?" He said, "Yeah, I spoke to Mark." He said, "There was no taxi driver. He doesn't remember you." So you have to kind of wonder, why would Mark Chapman, and then also Mark Chapman's never said he's met James Taylor either, and Chapman was a massive music fan in the 70s. So you have to sort of wonder, why would he not talk about those experiences? What's he got to lose? He's in prison. He probably knows he's never getting out. So if he had a crazy taxi drive around town dropping things off, and if he bumped into a very famous, rock star, why would he not mention that? So for me, and even going to the Yippie headquarters, that was quite a prominent building at the time. It was well known, wasn't it, in New York? I mean, you'd know this more than me, Ed, but that wasn't just like, something tucked away in a corner. It was
well known, and I think at that period of time we had the nightclub across the street. By the way, too, you mentioned before Blondie and Lockman, her musician, they were right around that area too, because CBGB was right around the corner, and then the nightclub Studio 10 was right across the street, and AJ Weberman lived across the street too.
What a fame!
Coup d'etat in America. He knew Frank Sturgis. He sued E. Howard Hunt, and he hung out with Lennon. And
still connected. Connected. It's crazy. Yeah, so I think there's two solutions here. I think you're either talking because the thing about Mark Chapman is, if you talk to most people who saw him that weekend, and certainly all the people that were in contact with him around the Dakota, the kind of the feedback that comes back is he was docile, really meek and mild-mannered and polite. He just wasn't this agitated, crazy guy mouthing off about Lennon. So it seems like a completely different Chapman persona. So it was, for me, it's either a Chapman double put in there to build a Chapman legend, that Mark Chapman was a kind of crazy, agitated guy. He was a drug fiend who was obsessed with John Lennon, which is, he mentioned John Lennon to James Taylor and Mark Snyder, so he dropped that in. Or it was some kind of programmed, states, drugged up Mark Chapman who was almost malfunctioning in a way and going around acting in a haphazard way, because the Chapman that allegedly shot John Lennon was a very cold and calculated guy. What he did wasn't frenzied in any way. What he allegedly did was, he just stood there, he waited as John walked past. According to the legend, he very casually got a gun out and shot him in the back. So this is not some crazed guy running up to John, shooting him wildly. So the two personalities don't match of the Chapman that you, James Taylor, and Mark Snyder saw, and the Chapman who allegedly shot John Lennon. So it's very interesting. And of course, as you know, in the JFK assassination law, there's a lot of talk that there was two Lee Harvey Oswalds, and there's lots of sightings of Lee Harvey Oswald doing strange things in places that we know Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't doing, because he was verifiably somewhere else. So it seemed like there was a Lee Harvey Oswald double, running around Dallas doing odd things, when the other, the verifiable Lee Harvey Oswald was definitely elsewhere. So it's fascinating.
Right. In this case, the Chapman who was hanging out in front of the Dakota made friends with young women there that went out to dinner with him later on. So they had no fear of him. And Padermo, if it was a serious guy we think he is, any doorman is, wasn't intimidated by this kid or worried about him.
Not at all. Yeah, Jerry and Jude. Yeah, he went to lunch and they both said he was a sweetheart.
Yeah.
And you're right. And Padermo at that point, Dakota Jose, had worked there for 11 years. So he probably had got a good idea about who was suspicious and who wasn't. I don't think the agitated guy you three met was the same guy that was at the Dakota, which, if that's the case, that does sort of make you wonder, well, why would such a person be put up to doing those kind of things?
See, one more thing that had convinced me of all this is when I got the Fenton Bressler book.
Great book.
Yeah, I had the book. I sent a letter to the publisher, and then I got a letter back from Fenton Bressler. And at the top of the letter, there was a phone number, a fax number. This was like in the 90s. I had a fax machine. And it was faxes? Yeah, it was that thermal fax paper, too. It wasn't even the paper.
All right, I remember those.
Yeah. It came on a roll, And so I faxed him back a letter, and then he faxed me right back. And we're writing notes on each other's handwritten notes.
Oh, fascinating.
I know. I wish I had saved that stuff. But the thing is, he said to me, he confirmed to me, the cab driver, it had to be, and so did the other guy too, the yippie type guy, the marijuana advocate guy. They both confirmed to me too that the cab driver drove Lennon to the village.
You mean Chapman?
Chapman to the village. So that was another issue. But then again, I brought so much question into my mind that I've never been so conflicted as I am right now. Now, what else do you make, though, of Chapman? Because he has this art collection. He has this history of overseas in Beirut, doing security work in Beirut.
Wow.
What's going on?
Where do we start? Where do we start with Mark?
Well, we'll have you come back. We're going to have you come back. We've only got about another 20 minutes here, but we'll have you come back.
Okay. I think with Mark, here's how I see Mark. If Mark was a guy who just lived with his parents and he was a kind of strange, geeky type guy who lived in his bedroom all his life, and he got a bit obsessed about the Beatles, and, he basically snapped and went off and shot John in some crazy, psychotic episode, I go, yeah, sure, just a guy who just snapped. But Mark Chapman's life was not like that at all. He had a very mysterious, strange life where often money didn't seem to be an issue. And the people that he was hanging around with were often quite nefarious, and they often had links to the military and the intelligence agencies. And there's also a streak of associates that Mark Chapman's had in his life that were all very heavily connected to hypnosis. So when you start to put all those things together, intelligence, hypnosis, military, untold money, strange, nefarious organizations, you start to sort of think this is not a normal life. You see, I think if Mark Chapman was, and I'm fairly convinced he was, a Manchurian candidate who was groomed to do something that he wasn't really in full control of doing, if you kind of look into how these things are done, you would have to start at a very early age, and it wouldn't just be a hypnosis thing. There'd be drugs involved, and it'd be a kind of grooming sort of process. And I think Mark Chapman was groomed from a very early age. I think he was identified at a very early age, and I think he was very slowly maneuvered through Georgia and through Chicago and then through Hawaii to be conditioned to be ready to be activated to commit what he thought was a nefarious act. And there's no question that Mark Chapman was at the Dakota. Whether he was firing a gun or not is up for debate. I think he probably was firing a gun. But the key question is, did he have full understanding of what he was doing at the time? And I think when you look into who was controlling him and how much hypnosis and drugs was part of his life and how much hypnosis was part of his life incredibly after he was arrested, there was so many hypnotists piling into his police cell. It was almost like a hypnotist convention in his police cell. And some of them were very heavily connected to the CIA. So when you put all that together, it's just endless red flags of this guy is a potential Manchurian candidate. And then when you start to put together the forensics, and when you start to put together the investigation that didn't happen, and then you put together... You see, I think if you're going to create something like this, there's four components. You've got to groom someone like Mark Chapman from a very early age to the point where you need to activate him to do whatever you need him to do. And remember, Chapman always said that he considered killing John Lennon as a compulsion, that he couldn't stop. He was compelled to do it. It was a runaway train. He had to be there. But after he did it, he had no idea really what he'd done. It was almost like, as he described it, the film came out of the camera. So you have to get Chapman to that point, and that takes a lot of years and a lot of patient, building up his profile mentally. I think you then got to have someone on site to actually pull off the murder professionally. So that takes planning, and that takes, obviously someone, if you're going to have a second shooter scenario, they need to really know what they're doing. You've then got to have a police force that are not really going to do their job properly and are going to brush over a lot of what needs to be done. And I can assure you, after going through all the police notebooks and paperwork that I've managed to get hold of, there was no real proper investigation. And I've spoken to people at the Dakota where they said that literally the morning after, they were washing up Lennon's blood with a mop and people were coming and going through the driveway and through the concierge's area. There was no men in white suits picking debris off the floor. So you've got to have a compliant police force. And then finally, you've got to have people in the media who are prepared to build the legend and are prepared to build the Mark Chapman story that fits with what Chapman was saying at the time, what he's done previously leading up to that point, and what he was going to do after he was arrested. So it's almost like an assassination of Mark Chapman took place in the media after the murder. And that often was very conflicting. There's been so many different, theories about why he did it. They're all basically nonsense because, Chapman changed his mind why he did it 3 or 4 times. But I think he was coerced to do that. And we can talk about that, the catcher in the rye and the various other reasons that people thought, why Chapman did the act. But I think when you put together all those components and you see who was behind Mark in his life and what, where they were guiding him and what he was doing and all the suspicious activity that he was getting up to, it's overwhelming, the evidence that he was, it's highly likely that he was a Manchurian candidate. And for me, the only question is how competent he was of the act he was thinking he was doing, i.e. killing John Lennon, murdering John Lennon, or whether he was just completely in a hypnosis daze at the time. That's the only question for me, is just how much he knew of what was actually going on. It's fascinating.
Now, Chapman had a connection to Scientology?
Yeah, the Scientology one, only slightly. Chapman got triggered to get on his mission, as I would call it, in August 1980. 2 things happened in the summer of 1980. One is he suddenly got obsessed with The Catcher in the Rye. You'll see a lot of people say that he was always obsessed with it. That's just not true. I've spoken to most of his friends. He never spoke about the book. He never read it. They never saw him read it. He basically got into it round about the summer of 1980, and he became obsessed with it to the point where I think it was a trigger device. The second thing he became obsessed with after that was John Lennon. He suddenly became obsessed with John Lennon and obsessed with his life, and the 2 things started to fuse together, the phony and Catcher in the Rye and John Lennon being a phony. And 2 other interesting things happened in August 1980. Ronald Reagan was pretty much a shoo-in at that point to win the election. Everyone sort of thought he was the front runner, so it was looking like Reagan was going to get in. And also John Lennon returned to the recording studio. So all these things coalesced at the same time as Mark Chapman being triggered to get on his Catcher in the Rye, kill phony Lennon mission. And round about, I think it was November, when Chapman was getting very close to being, I think, put into motion, so to speak, that's when he was calling up the Scientology I don't want to call it a church, let's call it a church. The Scientology church organization in Hawaii, and allegedly he was ringing them up with, kind of Bart Simpson-like annoying phone calls. That only comes from one source, a Scientologist in Hawaii from the time who spoke to the press about it. He had no evidence, he had no proof that Chapman was doing it. I think at that point, by November 1980, Chapman was capable of doing anything, to be honest with you. I think he was, his mind was completely in a different place, and I think that was deliberate. So he may have rang up the Scientologist and given him a bit of abuse on the phone. But again, it's just one of those kind of sideshow little stories.
Yeah.
It doesn't really, give us much. There's plenty of them in this case.
What about you hear that he has some kind of connection to Kenneth Anger and Kenneth Anger?
Yeah.
Oh, that's true? What do you got there?
Yeah, I can confirm that, because I've got all the police vouchers of all the evidence, which is amazing. So I can tell you what happened and what didn't happen through those vouchers. Kenneth Anger actually handed in some bullets, some .38 bullets from Mark Chapman to the NYPD, and I've got the voucher of Kenneth handing in the bullets. And according to the voucher, it just says that Mark Chapman gave these bullets to Kenneth Anger. It didn't give any more detail than that, but Kenneth felt he needed to hand them in to the NYPD. So yeah, if you believe Kenneth Anger, And he did turn up with some bullets that were collected by the NYPD. I think it was about a week after the murder, after John's murder. Then that did happen. What Kenneth has said subsequently is Mark came up to him in Hawaii. I think it was a film festival in Hawaii. Again, round about kind of the sort of mad November month in 1980 when Mark was off the rails, so to speak. And apparently he approached Kenneth Anger and gave him some bullets and said, "These are for John Lennon, there's more to come." Again, it's a bit like the Scientology thing, really. You've got a guy who's just acting in a really haphazard, kind of crazy way. It's a bit like the kind of guy that you and Mark Schneider and James Taylor encountered, really. It's like a different Mark. It doesn't really add up to the docile, geek that I think Mark Chapman really was.
Interesting you mentioned hypnosis, because Yoko was known to be very into hypnosis. And one thing that always struck me is that you read these accounts of Lennon and Yoko and Yoko's entourage leaving the car to enter the house that night, but then you never hear of any of these Yoko friends ever again in history. Not even a passing mention of these people.
Well, the group of friends that were allegedly with the Lennons when they came back, I don't think there was a group of friends. I think what happened was a group of people amassed pretty quickly at the Dakota after gunfire was heard. One of them famously is a guy called Sean Strube, who the TV stations were very enamoured with, and he gave loads of statements as if he was a witness, but he saw very little. He came there just as they were carrying John out. I think what's happened is 2 or 3 newspapers picked up on that there was a large crowd gathering, and I think somehow it kind of morphed into the Lennons had a group of people with them when they got into the Dakota. I've spoken to the concierge Jay Hastings, who was what's called an oral witness. He could hear what was going on outside in the driveway because his window to the concierge's office was just behind the vestibule doors. So Jay got used to hearing different people coming and going. He got used to hearing different footsteps and different cars pulling up. And he said he heard the Lennon's car pull up. And he heard Jose opening the door, and he heard John walking up towards the vestibule doors. So if there was a group of friends, I'm pretty certain Jay would have heard them. So Yoko's obviously never said there were friends there. I mean, there could have been. She might be lying, but I can't see why she would lie. And I think if there were other witnesses there that were with John and Yoko, I think one of them would have probably broke cover by now and said something. You've also got a taxi driver called Richard Peterson, and you've got a taxi passenger called Franklin Welsh, who both said they saw John and Yoko get out of their limousine, and neither of them have said they saw other people with them. So we can be fairly certain that it was just them two turning up at the Dakota that night.
Have you had a chance to talk to Elliot Mintz?
Do you know, Elliot's one of the few people I haven't spoken to. And the reason why I haven't spoken to Elliot is he didn't see anything. I mean, he kind of... The Elliot Mintz story is he was in LA. He heard very late at night that John had been shot, and that's possibly true. I mean, John was shot at 10 to 11. I think the media got hold of it 11:15, and Elliot said, he heard the news near midnight in LA, and he rushed to LA airport and got the last plane, red eye, out to New York. And he wasn't sure whether John was alive or dead. That's probably true, to be fair. I think Elliot's probably telling the truth. And then, of course, when he got there, he did what Elliot does, and he's often talked about seeing blood on the floor, and he's kind of dramatised it all up. But he's got nothing really to say, because I've spoken to Fred Seaman, who was there. Right. I've spoken to Michael Medeiros, who was there. So I don't really... I mean, I've got nothing against Elliot Mintz, but he's very much, obsessed with Team Yoko, and he's very much Yoko Ono's guy. And I'm not sure how objective he'd be regarding what went down in Dakota after the murder. I mean, Fred Seaman's got his own problems with Yoko, and, I don't always believe what Fred's told me, but Michael Medeiros certainly had no lawsuits against Yoko, so Michael has no axe to grind, so he's a really useful piece of information, source of information for post-Lennon Dakota stuff. But Elliot...
very interesting that in the Small World department, Elliot Mintz today is the manager of Paris Jackson, Michael Jackson's daughter, who has a very deep occult background if you check out her Instagram. But Elliot Mintz was also the agent for my agent, Gina Rodriguez. Okay.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And he was also the agent, too, for Paris Hilton. But he was the agent for my agent who got me involved in the whole Tiger Woods thing.
Interesting.
And, yeah, I know, right? Small world, right?
Well, he's a very connected guy. I mean, I've looked into him. I've researched him. I mean, he's a fascinating guy. I think he's got a book coming out next year. And, you know, he's interesting because I think back in the day, before he hooked up with the Lennons, he was doing some research into RFK's assassination.
Really?
And I think he was doing it, and I'm kind of, this is not my area of expertise, but I think he was doing it with an actor who was in Rebel Without a Cause with James Dean. And when the actor got murdered in rather suspicious circumstances, I think Elliot stopped his RFK Jr. investigation. Now, I can't be definite about that, but I'm fairly certain that's the case. So Elliot's kind of, if that's true, and I think it is, he's obviously got an interest in assassinations. And I know he said to some people that I've spoken to that he's aware that there's anomalies in the assassination. So, but whether he's prepared to look further into those anomalies, I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't. He's got nothing to gain. Elliot, as far as I can see, just likes hanging out with famous people, drinking fine wines, and dining out on his John Lennon stories.
He's done quite well for himself. You can say that.
He has. Yeah, he has. Fair play to him. I've got nothing against Elliot.
No.
I just don't think when it comes to the assassination, he's got anything to tell me.
Well, it's smart not to have anything against him. But let me ask a question. Is what do they call the occult? Anger and a deep occult involvement.
Oh, I mean, he's a horrible man.
Yoko, deep occult. What do you make of occult involvement in this assassination?
Well, let's talk about it. It can't be ignored. I mean, you know, Kenneth Anger, Chapman reached out to him. I think Yoko's occult didn't really go beyond numerology and tarot cards, to be honest, and astrology. I don't think she was kind of doing the kind of eyes wide shut, Kenneth, Stanley Kubrick kind of stuff. I think she was kind of dabbling. And she was, seriously interested in it. But I don't think there was anything dark about what Yoko was doing from what I know. Obviously, Kenneth Anger is a hideous thing who, obviously was a big Aleister Crowley fan. And he died, a few days ago, didn't he? 2-3 days ago.
About a month ago, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was a dyed-in-the-wool Satanist. I mean, he'd admit that. So a very unpleasant individual who I think's been hyped up to be something he's not when it comes to, with regards to his films. The thing about Anger's films is they're the kind of films that everybody likes to kind of name drop. Oh yeah, I love Kenneth Anger films, but they're not really going to watch them because they're unwatchable. Yeah. But with regards to the occult, here's the thing. I have spoken to a lot of Beatles people who knew John back in the day, who you can imagine none of them are real big fans of Yoko. Surprise, surprise. But a few of them, probably 3 of them, have said to me off the record that they have heard that the Process Church is involved somehow. And they all advised me to go looking further into the Process Church, which, as I'm sure you know, Ed, is a kind of offshoot of, I think it was the Family. It was a Christian cult. And they kind of, or did the Family come from the Process Church? I'm not sure.
The Process definitely did not. The Process Church of the Final Judgment definitely did not come from the Family. No.
Oh, I think it's vice versa. I think the Family was started by 2 members of the Process Church.
But you want to know
there is a connection there.
Do you want to know what? Yeah. They owned the Indica Art Gallery, the Process Church, and the Grimson owned the Indica Art Gallery where Yoko met John.
That's interesting,
isn't it?
That's interesting.
I know.
Yeah, that's true. That is. I mean, and there's, they were into Satanism. I think their big thing in the Process Church was they saw the devil as equal to Jesus, right. Something like that. Right. Or Satan and Jesus were. They worship both, basically. They're a bunch of cranks. I mean, I just don't think they had. I think they were too busy just doing their horrible, nefarious cult stuff to really worry about. I think to pull off what I talked about earlier with regards to getting Mark Chapman prepped to do what he did, and to get a second shooter on site to do what he has to do, or she has to do, and then to get, the NYPD signed up to not look too deeply into it, and then to get the media on board. Someone like the Process Church,
Okay.
They haven't got the means to do it.
We
Do you know what I mean?
definitely have to talk off the air, because if you follow the whole Maury Terry, the ultimate evil theory of the Process Church, they were involved in the Son of Sam assassinations.
Ah, that's interesting.
Yeah, we got to talk, bro,
That's
because there's a lot of stuff.
We do have to talk, because I do have Son of Sam connections to Mark Chapman.
Okay, then definitely, man. Okay,
I do. I do.
Let's talk off the air.
They're not still going now. Right? The Process Church aren't still going now, are they?
They're still out there, but they say I'm okay. They're okay with me. They like me. Okay.
They must be free. They're fringe now, surely.
Well, it's
fringe.
mostly relatives. It's mostly the distant relatives of them.
Right.
The offspring.
Okay.
Before we get into your book, give me some truth. The assassination of John Lennon. Tell us about yourself. Remind the audience, who is David Whelan?
I'm a TV producer from the UK, brought up in North London. Got very lucky when I was 17, managed to somehow get a job as a trainee in Thames Television, which took me on a career in TV, which has incredibly lasted 40 years this year, which is just kind of scary. But so I've seen lots of different developments in TV. Back in the day in '83 when I started, there was no computers, there was no videotape, it was all on film. It's strange how things changed rapidly over those last 40 years. But I've had a blessed career in TV, really enjoyed it. Mostly worked in sport, but I've worked a lot in news as well. And recently, after the kind of lockdown and the pandemic, I kind of started to move back more into kind of wanting to do news, documentary type work. And to be honest with you, Ed, the John Lennon thing just almost kind of fell in my lap. I wasn't looking for it. I was kind of open to anything really at the time, which I think a lot of people were in 2020. And just, I was listening to a podcast and somebody said, the doorman at the Dakota might have been working for the CIA, and I've always been a massive fan of the JFK assassination story after seeing Oliver Stone's film. So when I heard about a possible CIA connection to John Lennon's murder, I just thought, wow, I need to look into this. And 3 years later, I have a book and a documentary series coming down the pipe, and it's just it just snowballed, Ed, and the more I learned about it, the more I felt I just had to go deeper and deeper and uncover more and more things, because it just, right from the off, it didn't make sense. Nothing added up. And like most people, for 40 years, I just thought it was the most open and shut case in sort of criminal history. The guy shot him, he admitted it, they arrested him at the scene, he's been in prison for 42 years. We're not allowed to say his name because he did it because he wanted to be famous. And that was kind of it. I just never, ever thought there was anything untowards going on there. But boy, oh boy, is there there's a lot of anomalies in this case. And I'm now convinced, Ed, after 3 long years looking into this and talking to everybody and uncovering documents that no one's uncovered before and getting the detectives' notebooks, I'm 99% certain now that there was a second gunman in that driveway that night. Absolutely convinced now.
Well, so did the cop. The cop who arrested Chapman, he held him in front of him, and he says because he thought there was another shooter.
Yeah, I think what happened was, we'll just wind back really for the people who didn't hear our first conversation. Yeah. To just very quickly summarize, John and Yoko came back to the Dakota that night from the recording studio around about 10:50 p.m. Waiting outside the gates of the driveway was Jose Padermo, the doorman, and Mark Chapman. When Yoko walked past allegedly first and then John walked past Chapman, he took out a gun and according to Chapman and some witnesses, he shot John 4 times in the back with 1 bullet missing from a 5-shot revolver. When the cops, what happened after that was somehow Chapman's gun ended up on the floor. Somehow it was kicked to the back of the driveway, allegedly. It was then picked up by a lift operator, who we can talk about shortly. And the gun was taken away from the scene. So when the cops turned up, Officer Spiro and Officer Cullen, who were the first on the scene, they saw Chapman there, and they said they saw other people in the driveway. Now, those other people are probably, or almost certainly, they're going to be Joseph Manny, the lift operator, who came back up into the driveway after he went and hid the gun. But he also had 2 colleagues with him, Joseph Manny. He had a guy called Victor Cruz and Joe Grezek, So there was 3 people from the basement who came up after the gun was taken away by Joseph Manny originally. And I think they're the people that Spiro saw at the back of the Dakota driveway. And I think they're the people that spooked Spiro, and he got his gun out and was concerned that there might be other people on the scene who were nefarious in intent. But if there was a second shooter, by the time Spiro and Cullen got there, he'd have been long gone, or should have been long gone, because we're talking probably 2 to 2.5 to 3 minutes before the cops actually got there. So there was plenty of time for a gun to be taken away. There was plenty of time for Joe Manny to go downstairs and hide the gun and come back upstairs with his 2 co-workers. So lots went on after gunfire was heard.
And now when you say lift operator, are you talking about a cab driver or an elevator operator?
No, elevator, sorry, yeah, I should use the American vernacular. Yeah, he was an elevator operator, Joseph Manny, and he used to work the door as well. In fact, he was working the door that afternoon. And when Chapman was hanging around, Joseph Manny, or maybe the day before, I'm not sure, it might have been. No, I think he was working the Dakota door that morning, because he said he had a chat with Chapman, Joe Manny, and said, why are you here again? And I think he spoke to him when he went back downstairs to do some work in the basement. And I think he said to Chapman, if I can recall my conversation with him, and he said to Chapman, why are you here still? You've got the autograph, because he saw the Double Fantasy album with the autograph on it. And Joe Manny inquired to, Chapman, well, what are you doing still here? And I think Chapman said to him that he was waiting to get Yoko Ono's autograph. And Joe Manny, like a lot of people, thought he was a bit creepy and a bit weird. And off he went downstairs to the basement. And we didn't see Joe Manny back into the story until gunfire was heard. And I've seen the witness statements. I've spoken to Joe many times, but I've seen the witness statements of Grezek and Cruz. And they both corroborate that they came up with Joe Manny when they heard gunfire. So the 3 of them came up in the elevator from the basement into the driveway. For some reason, Joe Manny was the guy who picked up the gun. Jose probably knew him better than the other 2, because Joe sometimes worked the door and covered for Jose. So I think Jose then said to Joe Manny, take this gun away. For some reason, all 3 of them went downstairs into the basement with the gun, which doesn't make sense. But then we also, going by the testimony of Grezek and Cruz, all 3 of them then came back up into the driveway to see what was going on after they hid the gun. So it was all very strange, really, very, very odd. But of course, when the police turned up, Chapman didn't have a gun on him. So, the chain of evidence was broken many times.
Yeah, very odd that they would, and the gun was in a drawer, a desk drawer down in the basement, in the maintenance.
That's right.
Right, very odd.
That's right.
Would remove a gun from a crime scene, even in the 70s.
Well, I just don't know what Jose was thinking. I mean, Chapman says he can't remember whether he dropped the gun or whether Jose shook it out of his hand. But most people, including Chapman, say that the gun somehow ended up at the back of the driveway. Now, there is a cab passenger called Franklin Welsh who strangely says that they saw Padermo kick the gun to the back of the driveway. So that gives you some indication that this perhaps happened. But Franklin Welsh has never, ever been located since the time of the murder when he gave that statement. He's just disappeared from history. I've tried to find him for many years, and he's a ghost, really. But I find it odd that if you get out of a cab at that location, and remember the cab was behind the Lennon's limo at the time, I don't quite see how he can see a gun that's going to be slightly inside the driveway in a dark driveway at night. I just don't know how he managed to view that from the potential angle that he was standing. But he says he saw it, so we'll go with it. But you've got to ask yourself the question, why did Jose Padermo, the doorman, wait for Joseph Manny to come up and then ask Joseph Manny to take the gun away? Why didn't Jose, if Chapman was apparently doing very little at that point and he was kind of docile and confused, the gun was kicked away from him. Why didn't Jose just pick the gun up himself and take it into the concierge's area and give it to the concierge, Jay Hastings, or just hide it somewhere within the lobby area? He didn't need to wait for Joseph Manny. But for some reason, Padermo was very keen not to get his prints on that gun. So it's very, very strange behavior.
Or just put it in your pocket. Because I remember too, back in 78, so 79, right?
80.
In 1980, okay, around that time, it wasn't like, it's not like nowadays, the cops show up, you don't even want to have your hands in your pockets or anything, you just get shot.
Sure.
But back in those days, you could have held a gun in your hand and handed it to the cops. Say, here you go, back in those days. Now,
yeah, it was very bizarre behavior.
Yeah, everything from this thing from beginning to end is just so weird. And this is one of those things, too. Just think, man, David, just like the JFK assassination, everybody remembers where they were. 9/11 and John Lennon assassination. It's like the three ones where everybody remembers where they were.
Yeah, for sure.
When they heard
it. For sure. I mean, I was a schoolboy at the time. I was only 14. I got a bus to school. And I remember vividly, I didn't know who, I've got to be honest with you, I don't think I even knew who John Lennon was when he was shot, because I was only 14 and, for the last 10 years, he hadn't done much that would have got on my radar. I was just into pop music. And the beat was about 10 years gone at that point. So, but I do vividly remember seeing on the bus a sea of newspapers.
Yeah.
I can remember it like it was yesterday. And every single newspaper said on the front, John Lennon shot dead. And I vividly remember thinking to myself, who's this John Lennon guy? It's like, he clearly is someone very important. And, of course, when you get to school, people start to talk about it. It was like, oh, okay, yeah. I knew who the Beatles was. Obviously, at 14, I'd known by that point who they were. But it was, it didn't mean much to me. But, of course, then afterwards, it was like a John Lennon fest, wasn't it? We had Imagine in the charts. And you couldn't get away from that song. And there was constant documentaries and books about it ever since. And, I'm not a big fan of John Lennon's solo work, to be honest with you, Ed. I think between, let's say, 64, Rubber Soul, to 69, the last album the Beatles did, I think for that 5-year period, he was probably about as good as anybody has ever been in popular music. The work he created in those 5 years is just extraordinary. But I don't really rate what he did in the 70s. I think the first couple of albums were okay, but those mid-70s albums when he was just doing a lot of drugs and drinking, and it's just they're very poor albums as far as I'm concerned. And the sad thing is, of course, Double Fantasy did show a lot of promise, and there was some good stuff on there. And I think he was beginning to get his mojo back. So it is a tragedy that we'll never get to see where he would have gone from that point onwards. But you're right. Even for someone like me who didn't know who he was, I still remember the event because it was just wall-to-wall coverage, wasn't it, across the world's media.
Oh, forget it. And plus in New York, the Daily News and the New York Post had double page, like the first 5 pages were one article after another with big giant pictures of Lennon in the morgue, which again, too, how does that kind of thing happen,
I think it was the bodyguard who took that picture.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, you have a Substack, right? If you go to David Whelan, Whelan on Substack, and one of the articles, like the first one you wrote back in April, was the 20 most common misconceptions about John Lennon's murder. So why don't you take us through that?
Sure. I mean, firstly, just to point out that I think it is the most misunderstood sort of major crime in history, really. Most people really don't have a clue about what really happened. And it's just been the story's been very cleverly weaved as a very simple open and shut case, but of course it's nothing of the sort. So I think the first thing that really screams out that people need to get their head around is the anomaly about the entrance and exit wounds, which is of course very similar to the JFK and RFK assassinations. If you listen to, so point number one is, if you listen to the media and the NYPD and Mark Chapman himself, they are all adamant that John was shot in the back. He was walking away from Mark, which we know. He was heading towards a vestibule over to the right. Mark was standing over to the left. Mark is adamant he shot 5 bullets before hitting John in the back. I've spoken to the lead detective. He's adamant that that's what happened, and the media at the time reported that case. I think Wikipedia today say that it was 2 times in the back and 2 times in the shoulder. So that's slightly changed now. They're slightly hedging their bets on Wikipedia. But ultimately, they say he was shot in the back. Problem is, if you talk to Dr. Halloran, the surgeon who tried to save John's life at the Roosevelt Hospital, and if you talk to Deatra Sato and Barbara Camera, the 2 nurses that were by his side helping him do that, they all say unequivocally that he was shot 4 times in his upper left chest area above his heart in a tight professional grouping. And what's interesting about that is 4 went in the front, and they say 3 came out of the back with 1 bullet staying in John, and they believe that was the bullet in his upper left shoulder area. But what's really interesting about that is you cannot be shot in the back if there's 4 holes in the front and 3 out the back. Clearly, he was shot in the front. And I said to them, was there a discrepancy with entrance and exit wounds? Was it messy? Could you not tell perhaps what an entrance and exit wound was? And they all said, no, we could tell that we're very experienced. We've seen many gunshot wounds in New York at that point in our career, and we knew exactly what an entrance and exit wound was. And John had 4 entrance wounds in his upper left chest and 3 exit wounds out of his upper left back. And what was interesting about that as well is that the upper left back exit wounds were in a complete straight line, so the bullets didn't move around. There was a direct line of fire there. So I think when you I've spoken to Dr. Halloran and the nurses countless times, and we've gone over this many, many times, and they're all absolutely adamant that that is the case. The problem is that this has only come out recently because one of the doctors, who was actually the head of the ER at the time, a doctor called Stephen Lynn, for many years, well, for 30 years, Stephen is the guy who inferred that he was the man, he was the surgeon who saved John Lennon's life, when he didn't actually do that. He was in the room. He did come into the room later when he was called in, and he did go and talk to Yoko Ono, but he was not helping and assisting in trying to save John Lennon's life. So he didn't really get a good chance to see the wounds. So for the last, from 1980 to 2011, for 31 years, when people asked him about the entrance and exit wounds, he was a bit vague because he didn't really know, because he wasn't really paying close attention because he was standing at the back of the room. So what that means is that for 31 years, the medical truth about John's entrance and exit wounds were concealed from the public, which is very damning, really, for that particular surgeon. But this is what happens, Ed, in cases like this. One thing I've learned in the last 3 years, and I'm sure you know in your line of work, just people embellish. Yeah. They just get carried away, and they want to insert themselves more into a story than they deserve to be. To get their little glint of fame. And
David Whelan, let me stop you right there.
Yeah.
Because there's something called malpractice lawsuits, okay? And would you want to associate your work with being involved with the death of John Lennon, all of the heavy pockets there, when you weren't? Think about it.
Yeah, it's strange. It is odd. I mean, I think the thing he's often said, Dr. Lynn, is that he held John's, the big thing, you can see him on many documentaries over the last 40 years, and he always talks about holding John's heart in his hand, which is the thing that really upset Dr. Halloran, the surgeon who actually did that. And I think he saw him talk about it on a CNN documentary in 2010. And I think that was the point where Dr. Halloran went, I've had enough. I need to break cover here and tell the world that it was actually me that tried to pump John's heart with my hands. I can't let Dr. Lynn get away with this anymore. And I said to Dr. Halloran, why did you let him say that for 30 years? Why didn't you step up earlier? And if you talk to Dr. Halloran, he's just one of those old school guys who just doesn't want any fuss, doesn't want any big hoo-ha about what he did. He just quietly gets on with his work. And he was very wary of the media. But I think he regrets that he didn't come out earlier and say, no, actually, it was me that tried to save John's life and not Dr. Lynn. Because if you actually watch some news footage, you can actually see it on my YouTube channel, of Dr. Lynn when he came out and spoke to the media, directly from the ER room when they couldn't save John's life. And he sort of tells all the press there that John had died. He has a pristine white coat on. You just sort of think, where's the blood, man? If you're holding John's heart in your hand and trying to pump him back to life, you're not going to be standing there in a pristine white coat. So, yeah, that's I think that's why the medical evidence has taken so long to get out.
And what is the name of the YouTube channel?
If you go to Assassination of Lennon, you'll see I put all the relevant clips on there. I think there's about 30 videos on there now. Of anything that I think is important in the case. Because if you go through all the documentaries over the years, little bits of truth, come out between the cracks. Let's put it that way. So We're getting there. We're getting closer to the truth. So do you want to go back to the misconceptions, Ed? Should we go to number 2?
Yeah,
We've only.
You don't want to know the stuff I just wrote down, okay? If we have time at the end, we'll get to it.
Yeah, we've only made number 1, and we're sort of, we've got another 20 to go, so 19 to go. So anyway, myth number 2, John was shot in the driveway. So this one's really interesting. So if you look at all the dramatic reconstructions of John's death, and there's been a few dramatic films done on it over the years, and if you look at all the documentaries where they tried to do a reconstruction, and if you listen to what the NYPD say, and you listen to what the media say, and you listen to what Chapman says, they all say John was shot in the driveway as he walked up to the vestibule doors. He then went through the doors, up some stairs, blah, 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 and he went on this amazing journey with 4 holes in him. The problem with that is the evidence doesn't actually stack that up, because if you listen to what the lead detective Ron Hoffman said on the night at the Roosevelt Hospital, and again, you can see this video on my YouTube channel, he was caught off guard, and they basically said, where was John shot? And he said, inside the vestibule, which is an area, which is an enclosed kind of porch area where Chapman would not have been able to have seen John, never alone shoot him in it. There's also another guy at the hospital at the time, a secondary witness called Sean Strube, who said, again, outside the hospital, and you can see this on the YouTube channel, that he was told by the doorman, i.e. Jose Padermo, that John was shot as he was inside the vestibule. And I've spoken to Ron Hoffman last year about this, and I said, Ron, where do you think John was actually struck? And he said, oh, yeah, inside the vestibule on the stairway. So at that point, I could have said to Ron, you do realise that Mark Chapman could not see John in that particular area. But at that point, I think Ron was, he's quite an old guy. He's in his 80s. I didn't really want to kind of, trouble him with it anymore. But there's another little bit of evidence to say that John was shot inside the vestibule, and that is the concierge, Jay Hastings, had his office just behind the vestibule doors, and he had some bay windows that were open that night because it was an unseasonably warm night. And Jay said he heard gunfire after he heard the vestibule doors opening, after he heard the squeak of the doors. So when you take all this into account, I think John was shot inside the vestibule area. There's one other final clue that the doorman, Jose Padermo, who we spoke about earlier, said to Peter Cullen that the bullets pushed John through the door. Now, what's interesting about that is those doors, those vestibule doors, you pull them out into the driveway. You don't push in. So if John was being pushed through those doors by bullets, he would have had to have been inside the vestibule to have been pushed outside of the vestibules with gunfire. So I think when you take all those bits of evidence into account and all that bit of testimony into account, for me, I'm pretty convinced now that John was shot within those vestibule doors and out of Mark Chapman's sight. So there you go. John was not shot in the driveway.
What do you make of Ron Harrell's work that there were more bullet holes than bullets?
Yeah, I think what Ron, I've listened to those podcasts and they're very interesting, and he's obviously worked very hard on the case. But I think where he's got confused, and this happens a lot, is people like Stephen Spiro, Officer Spiro, has said things like, "Oh, there were bullet holes in the office windows." I think what he was referring to there was the vestibule door windows. And, you hear people like Ron Hoffman, the detective, calling the vestibule area the concierge's area or the lobby area. So I think people misname certain parts of that driveway when they're talking about the bullets in the vestibule glass doors. We know there were definitely 3 bullet holes in those vestibule glass doors. That's a certainty. I've spoken to many people who've all confirmed it. And you can see on my Instagram channel, Instagram page, again, Assassination Lennon, there are images that were shown of those 3 bullet holes quite clearly. So we know they were there, and they're in a very weird position. We can talk about them later. But I've spoken to everybody else. I've spoken to the cops that turned up. I've spoken to the lead detective. I've spoken to Joseph Manny, the elevator operator. I've spoken to concierge Jay Hastings. And I've said to all of them, did you see any other bullet holes or markings or anything that was, not the 3 vestibule doors? They said no. There was no other bullet holes. So, they were there. They worked there, and you think they probably, if there were holes in the wall or in the office window, or you would think that they would see them, or at least one of them would notice some other holes being there. But as far as we know, there are only 3 holes in those glass vestibule doors. But if you look where those holes are, what's really interesting about them, Ed, is they are way too low to be coming out of John's chest or back. Upper chest, upper back. They look to me kind of stomach height, lower back height. And again, you've got to look at them as well and think, where's the blood? There's no blood. There's no blood on the front of the doors. There's no blood on the back of the doors. So I think they are bullets that were shot that either missed John or they were bullets that came through the glass first and then hit John. For me, those bullets, I think Chapman is the only guy who could have feasibly caused those bullet holes. And then you've got to kind of ask yourself, if there's 3 bullet holes in those doors and Chapman shot 4 times or 5 times, did he miss 3 times and 2 hit John, perhaps, and the doctors and nurses got confused about entrance and exit wounds? It's really hard to say. Really, really hard to say.
Well, then what makes you conclude there was a second shooter?
Well, I think when you look at what Chapman couldn't do, i.e. shoot John in the chest, because John was walking away from him 25, 30 yards away, and John was actually in an area where Chapman couldn't even see him, never alone shoot him. I'm pretty convinced there was a second shooter within that vestibule area. There's going to be some stuff coming out soon that will verify that even more than just the medical evidence. There's stuff that's going to be coming out very soon that will, I think, give people real pause for thought with regards to a second shooter. But the key question is, I'm convinced of this, is Chapman was definitely there, and I think he almost certainly had a gun. And I suspect he even had bullets in there that were real, because if you look at the Siren RFK case, there's a lot to be said for Siren shooting blanks. I'm not sure Chapman was shooting blanks, to be honest. I think he might have had real bullets. There is one witness, Richard Peterson, a cab driver, who says he saw Chapman firing a gun. Peterson's testimony is troubling because he's embellished it over the years, but I think he's telling the truth. And I think Chapman was seen shooting a gun into the vestibule area. But interestingly, Peterson never saw John get struck, and neither, as Yoko Ono has also never said that she saw her husband get struck by Chapman's bullets. So, and then if you read Chapman's testimony himself, he again says, after I fired, I didn't know where John went. He just kind of disappeared, which is, again, a very odd thing to say when you're shooting four bullets into a guy's back. You'd think you'd be able to see him, and you'd be able to remember what happened after you shot him in the back. But Chapman has no recollection of that. He just says, I don't really remember aiming, he said. He said, I don't really remember pulling the hammer back. And I remember thinking how weird it was that the bullets were working. And you think, well, is that what a cold, calculated assassin would think? You'd think he'd know exactly what he was doing. And you'd think he'd know exactly what was happening after he was doing it. But Chapman seemed bemused that Lennon wasn't there after he started firing. So I don't think Lennon was there when Chapman started firing. I think Lennon was through the vestibule door, or at least partly through the vestibule door. And I think the bullets that were in the 4 bullets that were in Lennon's upper left chest area, I think they came from a second shooter. I think it's, for me, there's no other feasible explanation.
And if people can go check out our first interview we did, where we get into Chapman's background as a security officer, and all kind of weird stuff with this guy too. Now, what about the police response?
Well, okay. So we know Spiro and Cullen turned up. Spiro saw Chapman standing there reading a book. So he asked Chapman to put his hands up against the wall, which Chapman did. Cullen, the other officer, went inside to the lobby area and saw Lennon's prostrate body bleeding out. He then came running back out to Spiro and said, this is a real thing. There's a guy in here who's been shot. At that point, Spiro put some cuffs on Chapman. And Cullen then says, at that particular point, 2 other officers arrived, Officer Fraunberger and Officer Palmer.
And those were a couple of rookie cops that were parked right around the corner.
Yeah, they were fairly. I wouldn't say they were rookie, but they weren't senior. But what's interesting about Spiro is, this is another little interesting detail. He said to Cullen that night, "I think something big's going to happen tonight," which is a very odd thing for him to say. And then when they were driving Chapman back to the 20th Precinct station after they arrested him, he then said to Cullen, "I told you something big would happen tonight. I just knew something big would happen." That's a very strange thing, isn't it, for a cop to say? And Spiro was the guy who had a very close relationship with Chapman, to the point where he even wrote letters to Chapman, and Chapman wrote back to him, and he sold those letters for a lot of money, Spiro. So he's dead now, so, don't want to talk ill of the dead, but he's a very suspicious man, Spiro, to me. I think if there was a cop who was slightly suspicious, it would be him, for me, because of what he said that night. But anyway, getting back to the story, Framberger and Palmer turn up. They run into the back of the concierge lobby area. They run up the stairs, through the vestibule doors, up the stairs into the area. They see John lying there, bleeding out. And then they make a call. They say he's got blood on his chest and bullet holes in his chest. But what's interesting is neither Cullen, Framberger, or Palmer say that John had bullet holes in his back. They all say he was shot in his chest. When they took him to the hospital, they said we got a guy with chest wounds, gunshot wounds in the chest. No one has ever said that night or since that we had a guy with gunshot wounds in his back, which is very odd when you consider that that's what's supposed to have happened. So anyway, they turn him over. He's got lots of blood in his chest, and they make a call to carry him out and put him in a squad car and rush him to the Roosevelt Hospital, because they don't believe an ambulance will be there quick enough to save him. Because according to Framberger, John had a very faint pulse at that time, and that was the reason why they felt there was a chance to try and drive him quickly to hospital to save his life. But if you listen to Jay Hastings, the concierge, what Jay says happened was he heard the door open, squeaking open. Then he heard gunfire. A few seconds later, John comes running into his front office and says, "I've been shot," which is a strange thing to say. And then he kind of stumbles in a kind of drunken fashion into the back office, where, according to Jay Hastings, he collapses. And then Jay says he heard John sort of cough up, splutter up a kind of death gurgle, as he called it. And he's convinced, Hastings, that John died that very moment. And when Hastings went over to his body, he turned him over. Famously, I think he got his tie off because he was going to use it as a tourniquet. And then he realized that the wounds were just too extensive. All he could see was blood on John's chest. So he believes when the cops got there, when Framberger and Palmer got there and took John's pulse and they could feel a pulse, according to Hastings, that's just impossible. He was, at that point, he'd already passed away. But anyway, Palmer and Framberger then pick John up. One takes the legs, one takes the arms. Now, what's interesting here is Hastings said he helped them, but helped carry John out to the police car. But I've spoken to Palmer and Framberger, and they both say Hastings didn't help them carry John's body out. But Jay Hastings is adamant that he did. So believe who you want to believe there. They carry John's body out to another police car, Officer Moran. They put him in the back of the police car, and Officer Moran races off to the Roosevelt. And he's the guy that famously said that he asked John in the back of his car, "Do you know who you are?" And according to Moran, John said, "Yeah, I'm John Lennon." I just don't believe that. I just think that's complete garbage. I don't believe John would say that after what he's been through with 4 bullets in him. And I think at that point, John was dead, to be honest. We do know from the people at the Roosevelt that when he turned up, there was no pulse and he had lost a lot of blood, and it was all very much in vain at that point.
In your conversations with these cops, how common was it? It was by that time, it was uncommon for the cops to throw an injured person in the back of the cop car and take him to the hospital. Now it would be unheard of. Well, you forget it. No one's going to do that.
I just think it was the wrong move. I just think they should have tried to stem the blood flow and just wait for the ambulance.
The thing is, but it was uncommon by that point for cops to throw an injured person into the back of the cop car and take him to the hospital themselves.
Yeah, I mean, again, you're right. And Dr. Halloran said, the surgeon, he said that was the first thing that he thought was really weird, that the guy turned up in a police car. It's like, what the hell's that about? It's like, I've never seen that before, or very rarely seen.
Yeah, they had stopped doing that kind of thing by then. What do you make, too, again, with police response and this kind of stuff? When Chapman was brought into the police station, they had a coat over his head and he was wearing a bulletproof vest?
Yeah, what they did was they brought him in and they kind of they took him to two different parts of the station. They took him down to the sort of, after they interviewed him early on, he kind of got to the station around about 11 p.m. They put him in a holding cell in the main area of the station, not down in the kind of, the dungeons or where they keep most people overnight. And they waited till 12 o'clock before they strip searched him. He had $2,500 on him, which is quite a lot of money for 1980. I think that would be a substantial amount of money now. Yeah, if not more. So why he had that amount of cash on him is interesting. He had his Hawaiian driving license, which was useful because then they knew his name and address. So round about sort of 12:15, they knew who he was and where he lived. And round about sort of, and then did a statement. Then a detective wrote down Chapman's words, and they're very interesting. That statement to me is the most valuable Mark Chapman statement you can get. And again, it's on my Substack. I called the article Mark Chapman Unplugged, because this is kind of Chapman saying what he thought happened before anybody else got to him, basically, and tried to shape his thoughts and his feelings. And he's kind of confused. The whole statement is like, I really don't know what I've done and why I've done it. I had nothing against John Lennon. I don't remember really doing it. I don't know why I did it. After I did it, it all kind of went a bit weird. It's just the kind of statement, if you listen to the DA's office and the NYPD, they say he's a cold, calculated guy who's a loser who just wanted to shoot someone to be famous. And he wanted to kind of get the guy's fame through killing him. If that was the case, surely he'd have just said that in the police station. Yeah, I shot him because now I'm world famous. I shot a Beatle. Yeah, but he didn't. He doesn't say that. He sounds like he hasn't got a clue what's just happened, which is very odd. But then after that statement was taken, they then take him down to a holding cell below. I believe it was underneath the station, and they had to walk through outside the station into this holding area where they took him. And at that point, they were thinking about disguises. I spoke to some cop. They were thinking about putting him in a disguise. They just thought, oh, what the hell? We'll just put a coat over him, because they were concerned, allegedly, that there was going to be a Jack Ruby situation where someone would come out and try to shoot him. So they thought if they put a coat over his head, then nobody would know it was definitely him, and they might not, try and take a shot at him. But it was a very irresponsible thing to do, because the press were there. There were cameramen there. I suspect they weren't verified when they got in, so somebody could have got to him at that point. And there is another image of him under a coat when they took him to Riker Island the next day to be assessed, where again they put the coat over his head and they rushed him out at the station. All very unprofessional, all very
unusual.
Shambolic, I would say. Just kind of amateurish, really. But I've spoken to, you'd know this more than I would, Ed, but I've spoken to people who sort of dealt with the police at the time. They said it was all a little bit rough around the edges. It wasn't a very professional outfit in those days.
Oh, yeah.
And those are kind of things, those are sort of things that went on. But it seemed like they were just making stuff up on the fly. Not very professional.
Now, that sort of gave rise, the whole thing with the coat over the head gave rise to another theory involving Stephen King. Look into that one.
Oh, dear. Where do I start?
Ripperman.
Yeah.
There's two guys that started. One first guy was Ripperman, then another guy, Featherstone, I think is.
Yeah, Lightfoot or something. Yeah, it's just what's disappointing about these kind of things, Ed, for me. They're comical and they're amusing, but I think they're quite damaging, because there is a lot of anomalies in the John Lennon assassination, and the whiff of conspiracy is very strong. But when you get guys like this coming out with these crazy Stephen King did it, and I saw messages in newspapers that told me he did it, and these guys get coverage. He got coverage. He got interviewed. I think Larry King might have even interviewed him back in the day. And, that's just not helpful, because, when you get people going, oh, conspiracy theorists, that's what they're thinking of. They're thinking of guys like that who just come out with these crazy things, with no real substantial evidence behind it, and they get given airtime because everybody loves a crank, you know, and they're kind of interesting and funny, but it's also the guy slightly tragic, really, because he kind of drove around in a van, didn't he, for many years, trying to promote this theory. And, you know, it's just it's all a bit disturbing, really. And I just feel sorry for the guy. Of course,
the van. We used to see.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. We would see the van driving around, and he would also do the postering too. He had posters that he would poster up on the walls too about his theories too.
Well, they call it poisoning the well, don't they? Where people like this are kind of promoted to kind of confuse and make people not really think about the real anomalies in the case and the real potential second shooters. And if you've got some guy who appears crazy saying Stephen King did it, and I know because I got messages in the newspaper telling me so, or secret messages in the newspaper, it's not helping. It's really unhelpful.
And what about, because it was widely known both before and after till this day that Lennon and Yoko were under extensive FBI surveillance. Now, have you done FOIs, and gone after that stuff?
Well, I don't really need to, because the guy did an amazing job on that. I think his name was Jan or John Weiner?
Weiner, yeah, John.
Yeah, Weiner. Yeah, and he did a great book, called The John Lennon FBI Files. Right. And he basically did all the FOIs and got all the files released, and they were tracking him throughout the 70s, and they were tracking him right up until he got his card, which I believe was 75, 76. But what's interesting I find about those particular files and what they revealed was clearly that was under the auspice of Richard Nixon. He was the guy giving the orders for Hoover to do that and for the CIA to do it. And it's always believed that it was only an FBI operation. But there is actually a file in there that the FBI sent to the CIA on John Lennon. So they were clearly, both agencies were interested in John. And I know for a fact that MI5 have a lot of files on John that they're not releasing. So you've just got to ask yourself, and there's still unreleased files in the FBI files, by the way, that Weiner couldn't get released. So you've got to kind of ask yourself, what could a Beatle, a rock star, have that needs to be top secret to this day? What are you hiding? It's a bit like the JFK files. For me, it's very damning when they won't release files because they're clearly hiding something.
So one of the commonly repeated stories is that the FBI was following David Peel that night. They had mistaken David Peel for John Lennon, and they were surveilling him. Is that true?
I found no evidence to back that up at all.
Okay.
Absolutely none. Absolutely. But then again, when you're dealing with the FBI, anything's possible, isn't it, really? Because I don't think they're ever going to release all the files. And the thing about files also, Ed, I'm sure you believe, why would they be so sacred that they wouldn't destroy them? If they had incriminating files, how hard is it to stick it in a shredder?
Oh, that's absolutely true too. Or the night that the report was made, why not just fudge that? Interesting. You mentioned the INS, the whole immigration stuff. Is that his immigration lawyer was the same lawyer that Donald Trump later on used for all his immigration work?
I've spoken to people who knew John in the 70s, friends of John's. And they say, without a doubt, men in black were constantly shadowing them 24/7, constantly. And the phones were constantly clicking and were obviously being tapped. He was under a real severe surveillance operation, John, for years and years and years. It was harassment. There's no other word to describe it. And you've got to kind of ask yourself, why? Why was Nixon so obsessed with him? Because the actual charge that they were getting him on was a drug charge that he had in London. I think it was 69, where some hash was found in a flat. I think it was the same flat that Jimi Hendrix actually used to use at one point. It's a very famous flat. And that drug bust is because John said the drugs were planted at the time. And it was that they were kind of using as a kind of, a criminal that shouldn't be allowed to stay in the US. It was that very small charge of that drug bust charge in the late 60s in London that they were using to try and get him to kick him out of New York in the early 70s. And you've got to kind of ask yourself, why? And of course, there's only one reason why. Nixon hated him and John hated Nixon. And John was very vocal in his dislike of Nixon and his policies. And, he constantly used to berate him any chance he got. And, of course, when the Watergate hearings were undertook, who was sitting in the front row, smiling and enjoying the whole procedure? John Lennon.
Really? I never knew that.
Yeah. You can find the picture. Yeah, there's a picture of him and Yoko sitting there just lapping it all up. So they hated each other. The Nixon-Lennon thing is a real thing. They literally despised each other. John was very vocal in his dislike of Nixon. Obviously, Nixon didn't go on the record and say how much he disliked John, but I'm fairly certain the FBI, CIA surveillance of John was a Nixon directive. It had to have been.
Yeah, and also, too, John Lennon was going on the Mike Douglas show, bringing on, for a whole week, bringing all of Nixon's enemies on there, too, as well. That was
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it with John, everyone sort of says to me, well, why would anyone want to kill John Lennon? He was a washed-up rock star. But he was a very influential guy. I think we forget just how influential he was. And he was anti-war. So anybody that was in the military-industrial complex would have despised him for that. And he really was a serious anti-war campaigner. He was a guy that got, front-page headlines for his anti-war stance. He was anti-religion, which is something that I've only really come to appreciate researching this story. I mean, there's an incredible book called The Gospel According to the Beatles, where the author goes through all the kind of Beatles criticisms of religion over their career. And boy, did John and George Harrison criticize religion to a point where it was almost like a sport to them. Every single, interview they did, they were constantly attacking mainstream religion. Christianity, really. It was only Christianity was their main target. So, you've got anti-religion, you've got anti-war, and he was anti-capitalist. So for someone like Nixon, who had his fingers in a lot of wars and was a fairly religious man and was also, let's just call it on the right and a fervent capitalist, he would have disliked John, not just because of what John was doing against him, but ideologically, he would have despised John on many different levels. And not just Nixon, but, you can kind of, when you understand what kind of stances John took, you can get a kind of profile of the kind of person who would have despised John and liked to have seen him dead. And it's quite a dangerous person who is a fervent fundamental Christian who has military intelligence ties and is connected to Richard Nixon. And I'm not going to go into it now, but there are people like that around Mark Chapman. A lot of people like that around Mark Chapman who've been in the shadows for too long. And I'm looking forward to bringing some of them out into the light.
That's right, because Chapman was also involved with a Christian missionary group, right?
Yeah, he was. He worked for the YMCA, which is, I suppose, a Christian missionary group to some extent, though it's more home-based. The YMCA, he did a lot of work at a Vietnamese refugee camp, which some people say was infiltrated by the CIA. Not sure about that. I could never find, there's a lot of people who believe World Vision,
right,
which is John Hinckley's father's organization, that Chapman was associated with them through that refugee camp. But through my research, I can't find a connection with World Vision and that refugee camp. So I'm not saying it's not true, but I can't find any documentation that actually puts the two together. So we'll put a question mark on that. But he was very much involved with the Adventists when he went to stay in Hawaii. The Adventists ran a mental institution called the Castle Memorial Hospital, and that was the institution that Chapman was brought to after he allegedly attempted suicide. And he spent about a year there, maybe a year and a half. And after becoming a patient and doing quite well, we don't quite know how he was treated. I'd be very interested to see what kind of drugs and what kind of treatments he was being put under with the Adventists. But we do know they offered him a job as a janitor. So he went very quickly from patient to employee. And then after that, about 6 months later, he went to their kind of accounts department and said, look, can I have a loan, please? I'd like to travel the world. And the Adventists decided to give their janitor, who must have been on a minimum wage at the time, the funds to go on a around the world trip, which at the time, I think he must have visited maybe 12 or 15 countries. There wasn't many countries he didn't visit. He literally did go around the world. And how did they know he was going to pay the money back? Why would you give a janitor all that money to go and go on a global jaunt. It just makes absolutely no sense. But what's interesting about the Adventists is in the Korean War in the 50s, the Adventists didn't want to fight. They were conscientious objectors. And what the Adventist leaders decided to do to kind of placate the military was they said, well, look, okay, our guys don't want to fight on religious grounds, but we'll offer them up as guinea pigs. So the military used them, and I think there's a documentary on this which you can watch. It's quite good. And they used them through the Adventist leaders offering them up as human guinea pigs for lots of different drugs and lots of different sort of chemical warfare stuff. So the Adventists had a history of using their people as guinea pigs for the military, which is an interesting parallel when you think Mark Chapman was on their books for quite a while.
David Whelan, once again, we have burned through this time.
Oh, yeah, I can't believe that's an hour already.
David Whelan, very excited about that. You can find his Substack at substack.com, David Whelan. And he's got this YouTube channel called Assassination of John Lennon. So, David Whelan, are you there?
I'm here. How you doing, Ed? Nice to speak to you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for being so patient. We had a big problem with some construction going on outside, some lawn care. We couldn't quite get the show together.
No problem.
Remind the audience, though, who is David Whelan?
I'm a TV producer from the UK, born in North London, in my mid-50s now. Where did the time go? And for the last 3 years, I've been investigating John Lennon's murder. If you ask me, Ed, why I'm doing this, I often ask myself the same question. I literally just started looking into it in 2020 because I heard something strange about the doorman who was working at the Dakota that night. And from that point onwards, I got further and further into the case. And you know, someone like you, Ed, as a detective, you'd know exactly what it's like when you start to uncover stuff. It becomes kind of addictive, and it becomes like a jigsaw that you become very determined to kind of complete. And I think I've almost completed the jigsaw now. There's still a lot of very irritating big pieces that I need to fill in. But what I have discovered, Ed, is countless anomalies in the murder from the official narrative and what actually happened with the evidence to hand, which is disturbing. And I'm trying to tell the world about this via a book that's coming out at the end of the year, and I'm trying to tell the world about it via promoting the book via a Substack and various YouTube videos and evidence that I've managed to acquire from the lead detective. So it's explosive stuff. I think there's a lot more to go with regards to uncovering just a few more little bits that will really completely fill in all the gaps. But you know, Ed, I think like the JFK case and like the RFK case and like the MLK case, I don't think the complete truth about what happened that night when John Lennon was assassinated will ever come out. I think we can get very close to the truth, but the way I think these things are done, I think the truth will always be, the complete truth will be elusive, but we can but try.
It's so true. We've had John twice already, and we've barely scratched the surface. So people can find you on Twitter at Lennon Murder, and YouTube as Assassination of John Lennon.
Assassination of Lennon, it's called.
Assassination of Lennon, and the Substack.com is David Whelan, Whelan.
That's right.
Okay, so now, Dave, the last time we had you on, you were hinting around. You wouldn't. You said, "Oh, wait, there's a big story coming out. Get on the edge of your seat and wait for it." But I couldn't get it out of you. Right? We tried everything. But the story did come out. It came out here, okay, in the Daily Mail. Second shooter behind John Lennon murder. New evidence reveals bullets from two different guns were pulled from Beatles legend's body in autopsy. Okay, what can you tell us?
Okay, let's start with the official narrative. So the official narrative goes, and it's very well told and often repeated, that Mark Chapman shot John Lennon in the back, 20 yards behind John, 20 feet behind John, I should say, with 4 hollow bullets from a 5-bullet revolver gun with 1 bullet missing. Now, Chapman has made big play and often repeated that he used hollow bullets for the job. He got these hollow bullets from a very shady character called Dana Reeves, who we can talk about maybe later. But Chapman has been adamant and consistent that he was using hollow bullets. Now, Chapman was, back in the day, a security guard, an armed security guard. So he knew about guns. He was aware of guns. He was someone who'd actually used guns in his work. So he would know the difference between a hollow point bullet and a bullet that wasn't a hollow point. So let's just stay with that. With regards to the NYPD, who investigated the case at the time, they have also always stated that Mark Chapman used hollow bullets. So you can be certain that they would have checked, surely, you'd hope, what bullets Mark Chapman was using on the ground at the time, allegedly using. Let
me ask you a question real quick about the bullets, because at that time, the hollow point bullets that were very popular at the time were the Winchester silver tips. Is that what he was using?
Yeah, no, he was using a .38 cal bullet from, I think it was called a semi-wad cutter. And what it was the way you can tell a hollow point bullet when it's been fired is it pretty much always mushrooms at the top. Because on impact, it kind of blows itself open, so multiple shards go throughout the body, and it kind of slows itself down by this mushroom impact because the bullet kind of goes in on itself. So Chapman, the NYPD, and the New York District Attorney's Office, which is really important, another entity that you would imagine would, carefully assess the bullets that were used in John Lennon's murder, they have always said that Mark Chapman was using hollow bullets. And there's a guy called Kim Hogreth, who was the assistant DA at the time, the assistant prosecuting DA at the time. And people probably know Kim because they've probably seen him on many documentaries over the years, talking about the fact that the cold, calculated killer Mark Chapman used hollow point bullets because he was so cold and calculated and he wanted to cause maximum damage to John Lennon. So that kind of legend has been pretty comprehensively set, and nobody has ever questioned it. So when I started to investigate the bullets in the murder, which is a very important component when you consider things like JFK and RFK, where there was just too many bullets on the scene at Dealey Plaza and too many bullets in the Ambassador Hotel kitchen area, which is always a bit awkward. So I think you can tell an awful lot from bullets on the ground at the time. So the first thing I did, Ed, was I started to look through the evidence vouchers to see how many bullets were found on the ground. And what was disturbing was there was no record of spent bullets found on the crime scene. So I asked the lead detective, Ron Hoffman, quite a few times, can you tell me how many bullets were found at the scene? And he couldn't remember. He had a bit of a sort of memory fog about that. But what he did remember was finding five empty shells in Chapman's revolver, which you'd expect to be there. So if there were 5 empty shells, you can assume Chapman shot 5 times. And remember, just to go back, Chapman said he shot John 5 times with 4 bullets hitting John in his upper left back, or in his back, as Chapman calls it, and 1 bullet missed. So I thought, okay, we've got no bullets that were vouchered at the time. We've got Chapman's word for it. So I started to dig a little bit further, and I came across an evidence voucher from the morgue after John Lennon's autopsy. And this voucher was signed by a detective, so it wasn't signed by the chief medical officer, Elliot Gross. So for me, that's more valuable. It was signed by someone who was kind of an independent guy. It was a detective from the NYPD. Can't actually recall the guy's name, but it's on the actual sheet if anyone can find it online. It's quite easy to find now. And in this evidence voucher from the morgue, you've got 2 bullets. You've got one that's just called 1 lead bullet, and you've got one that's called 1 SWC lead bullet, which stands for semi-wad cutter. Now, a semi-wad cutter can be a hollow bullet, or it cannot be a hollow bullet. But what was odd for me on that morgue evidence receipt was clearly the detective put down 2 different descriptions for bullets. Now, they could both be the same kind of bullet, so I was thinking, okay, maybe the detective got it wrong, but I was kind of troubled why he described one as a lead bullet and one as an SWC bullet. So I decided to look a little bit further, Ed, and then I hit something quite disturbing. There was a photographer, a New York photographer called Brad Trent, and in 1989, Brad Trent was contacted by I believe it was Life magazine. I'm not completely sure about that, but I'm fairly certain it was Life magazine. And Life magazine were doing a piece on famous guns from history. And Life magazine asked Brad Trent to go to the ballistics department of the New York Police Department and take a photograph of John Lennon's gun, the gun that was used by Mark Chapman to kill John Lennon. So Brad Trent accepted the gig. He thought it was a bit morbid, but, he went and did it. He found the ballistics department of the NYPD very relaxed and very kind of dismissive about allowing him to just sort of sit there with the gun, with nobody actually watching him what he was doing, or there was nobody in the room when he was doing his work, which is very bizarre when you think how important that evidence was that they were allowing him to spend time alone with. I should just quickly say as a sidebar, he then went and took a picture of the gun that John Hinckley used to shoot Ronald Reagan, and that was a completely different affair with agents, federal agents watching everything that Brad was doing when he was photographing that gun. So it's quite interesting to see the difference between the gun that was allegedly used to kill John Lennon and the gun that was allegedly used to kill Ronald Reagan, and how those guns were perceived by the authorities that were looking after him. But anyway, that's the sidebar. So what he did was, Brad Trent, he got the gun, took a picture of the gun, but there was also a little envelope next to the gun. And in that envelope were 2 bullets. Now, you can see these bullets on my Instagram. You can see them on the web. You can see them. They're quite easy to find now because Brad Trent, thankfully, put a picture of these bullets and the gun on on a blog in 2011. So they've been kind of standing or sitting out there online in plain sight for quite a while now, but they've just been missed by people. And what you'll see in one of the bullets is one of the bullets has got a mushroom effect, like a hollow bullet. And the other bullet looks like a plain lead bullet with no mushroom effect. So they do look like 2 very different bullets. And I've had some ballistics guys look at that independently, and they've gone, yeah, they're pretty much 2 different bullets. One's hollow, one's not. And then to seal the deal, Elliot Gross puts on the envelope that the SWC bullet he then puts in brackets hollow. So that was the one that was, the SWC was the one, if you remember, that was described in the morgue evidence voucher. So when you put all those things together, when you put the voucher together from the morgue, when you put the envelope description, and then when you put the actual visual on the 2 bullets, it's clear to see that at the autopsy of John Lennon, 2 different types of bullets were discovered. So that, to me, you could say, Ed, that Chapman was using 2 different types of ammunition in his revolver. That is possible, hollow and non-hollow point bullets, both 38 cal. But that's highly unlikely when you consider that Chapman himself, the NYPD and the DA's office all insisted that he was only using hollow point bullets. But the problem is, Ed, one of those bullets that came out of John in the autopsy was not hollow.
Very interesting.
Did I describe that okay?
Yes, you did. Yeah. and it helps if you're looking at the actual receipts, which you could find on the Daily Mail article.
Yeah, you can find that. Yeah, it's there. It's there. It's been hiding in plain sight, Ed. And I think the reason why this has been missed is I think a lot of people just assume that the John Lennon murder, being one of the most famous crimes of all time, certainly of the 20th century, would have been investigated within an inch of its life. But it really wasn't investigated properly. And I think the fact that we still can't get a verification on how many spent bullets were found at the crime scene means that possibly the authorities didn't want us to know how many bullets were found there and what kind of bullets were found there. So then we've got to kind of ask ourselves, was one of those hollow point bullets a bullet that Chapman fired, and was the other bullet potentially a second shooter firing, or did perhaps the second shooter fire 2 different types of bullets to confuse? Or there is another option, that Elliot Gross, the chief medical officer, who's had a few accusations over the years I must state for the record, he's never been charged with this, but there's been lots of accusations that he was falsifying autopsies on behalf of the NYPD. Did perhaps Elliot Gross or somebody working in his department add a hollow point bullet into the evidence voucher for the ballistics, just to sort of shore up the official narrative that Chapman was using hollow point bullets? So it really is open to debate, and it's kind of one of those mysteries that I think has got a long way to go before we get it all covered up.
Looking at this receipt, okay, and by the way, people should understand this is exclusive to David Whelan. Okay, this is David Whelan's exclusive work here. Okay, in finding this receipt and doing this evaluation.
Well, not really, Ed. It's kind of out there. You know, I just joined the dots together.
Right,
it's kind of. This image is out there, Ed. It's been
and when it describes this 38 cal. It almost looks like it says load bullet, L-O-A-D. Is that a typo, or did you look at that carefully?
I think it's lead.
Well, the above one definitely says lead. A 38 caliber SWC lead bullet, but the other one almost says.
I think it's low. I think it's just a bad spelling of lead.
Gotcha.
Personally, but it could be low. It could be low.
Now the thing is too, which would make no sense, yeah. But now the thing is too is back in those days, see, right around this time, I would say about 1982 is when I became a huge hobbyist going to the range and firing firearms.
Brilliant.
Yeah, like insane. We would go through ammunition like they wouldn't believe. We'd go in there and buy ammunition with their best customers. And
right.
In New York City at that time, among these cops who used to work the range and stuff like that, lead was a euphemism for ball ammo.
Okay.
They would call ball ammo lead. And and then the hollow points back then, like I said, the popular ones were the silver tips. So you would call the ball ammo lead, and then the hollow points, you'd call them hollow points or silver tips. So very interesting. That they would call it lead. Yeah. So that's very interesting there. Also too now, you might want to load some ball ammo in front before your hollow points if you were going through a door. If you wanted to shoot. Go ahead.
Just explain to people, Ed, what ball ammo is, because I don't suspect everyone knows what ball ammo is.
Well, you have hollow points, and then ball ammo is lead, and it's like a big bullet. It's just like the bullet you see all the time with no holes in it, no.
Yeah, so it's basically just a normal bullet that's not hollow, really, isn't it? A ball ammo, from what I've.
Yeah, right. The hollow points, like I said, the silver tips, it's hollow at the top, and then there's like slits cut into it, like you would take a knife and chop it down. Right, so there's like little, and so then, like you said, it flares out when it goes into you and chops you up all over, cuts you up everywhere.
Yeah,
but you'd use ball ammo if you had to shoot the first couple of shots, maybe through a car door, or you wanted to shoot through a lock, and then once you got through that door or through that lock, and then you wanted to hit a human, then you'd have the hollow tips. But then again, how many shots? This is a revolver with 5 shots, right? That's unlikely too as well.
Leads into it is unlikely. I mean, it kind of screams of second shooter to me. It's very suspicious. If you listen to the testimony of people who have seen the autopsy, this is interesting. And I must admit, this is just second-hand testimony here. I've not got this verified, but I have spoken to people who have seen the autopsy, allegedly. And the things that they say that came out of that autopsy report that Elliot Gross noted down was 2 bullets were found in John's body/clothing. 1 bullet, according to Elliot Gross and the person who saw the autopsy, was found in John's neck. So it was shot from the back, and it kind of got stuck in the front of his neck. Another bullet, which he doesn't specify whether it was the hollow one or the non-hollow one, but another bullet allegedly got stuck in John's leather jacket. Right? So when I got this information, the first people I spoke to about it, obviously, was the doctor and nurses who treated John that night. And I rang them up and said to all of them, Dr. Halloran, nurses Cameron, I said to all 3 of them, can you just explain to me, this is what I've heard, I must again specify, I haven't seen this myself, this is what I've heard is in the autopsy, what do you feel about this? And they all said, no way is the neck one possible, because they all observed John's wounds very carefully, and there was no entrance wound in the back of John's neck. It's just a complete impossibility from where they saw John's wounds. So they can't quite figure out how that one got there, if it ever did get there. And I also spoke to them about the bullet that was lodged in John's leather jacket, and they said, well, we cut his clothes off with scissors, we threw his leather jacket down on the floor, we then picked his leather jacket up and we shoved it into an evidence bag that was going to go off to the autopsy the next day off to Elliot Gross. They think it's highly unlikely that they missed a bullet lodged in John's jacket, but it is possible, because if it was lodged inside his leather jacket, and if you look at the leather jacket that John was wearing that night, it was a thick leather jacket. So it's possible that one of the bullets might have got caught in John's jacket. It possibly didn't. I don't know. It's a strange one, because if you think about the official narrative, 4 hollow bullets, shot into John's back, not neck. One, I suppose Chapman could have got confused, and perhaps one of the ones that he thought was shooting into John's back kind of hit his neck. That kind of makes sense. But where's the other 2 bullets? And why are the 2 bullets that were discovered of a different type? Why are they not all hollow point? So the more you assess it, and the more information you take on board from the autopsy or from the morgue receipt or from the Brad Trent picture, the more it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And we haven't even got into, Ed, but we might as well now we're onto it, because it's a very important point. If you take a look at the kind of forensics on site with regards to the images that we have of the Dakota driveway after John was assassinated, we have 2 images of the vestibule glass doors. Now, these vestibule glass doors are really important, because this was the vestibule glass door that John was walking towards to go into his apartments and to go into the lobby area, which then led into his apartments. Now, if you think about Chapman is over, think about a tunnel, a walled tunnel. Chapman is at the head of the tunnel on the left-hand side by the road. John is walking down the driveway over to the right to these 2 glass vestibule doors, which kind of were closed off into a kind of little porch. And John would open one of those vestibule doors, he'd pull it open, and he'd walk into that vestibule area, which is like a very small phone booth kind of porch, which was put up in the winter to keep the Dakota warm. He then had to walk up some steps and then go into the lobby. But what's interesting about those 2 glass vestibule doors, and we have an image of the door facing the street, and we also have an image of the door from behind the vestibule, from the other angle, from behind where Chapman was standing. Both images show that there were 2 bullet holes, clear bullet holes with no blood or debris around them. So they were kind of gunfire. There was something being shot through those doors that didn't go through John first, it seems. But the problem is, Ed, they're very low down. They're not kind of neck height. They're not chest height. They're not upper left back height, which is what the doctors and nurses said. They're kind of waist height. They're kind of lower back height. And there is another bullet hole, which is very difficult to see, in the other vestibule door behind the 2 that we can see, the 2 bullet hole door we can see. Now, that one wasn't visible from Chapman couldn't see that at all, because it was kind of concealed by the door that's got 2 bullet holes in it. So the one behind the one that's got 2, Chapman couldn't even see that door. That door has a bullet hole in it. So we have 3 bullet holes in the vestibule doors that are all quite low down, lower back kind of region. Now, here's the thing. I've studied this case, Ed, for 3 years now, diligently for 3 years. I still can't feasibly figure out how those 3 bullets got past, those 3 bullet holes got passed through those glass vestibule doors. Whichever scenario you go with, if you go with the Mark Chapman scenario, shooting from the street, shooting John in the back 4 times, 1 missing, doesn't make sense. They're hollow point bullets. They shouldn't pass through John's chest. They certainly shouldn't pass through his chest and then dive bomb downwards and then go through a glass door. So that doesn't make sense. If you go with the second shooter in the vestibule, yeah, it kind of makes sense if you go with the medical testimony, because the medical testimony said 4 went in John's front, upper left chest, 3 came out of his upper left back. So the 3 that were coming out of his upper left back could feasibly, because remember, John in the vestibule is looking up some stairs. So if the second shooter was standing on the stairs, he'd be shooting down at John, and John would have his back slightly arched walking up the steps. So you could see those 3 bullets coming out of John's back at that angle, potentially going through those vestibule doors and making those holes. But again, it's quite hard to feasibly account for that when you see there's no blood on those doors, on those glass doors. There's nothing came. But then I suppose if the bullets were going through John's chest and back and through his leather jacket, potentially no blood actually came through. Because if you listen to the cops, who saw him immediately after he was shot. And if you listen to the concierge and the lift operator and all the people that saw John, they all say all the blood was on his chest area. None of them mention blood in John's back. They all mention John having a really bloody, messy red chest, upper left chest. So those 3 bullet holes in those vestibule doors are still up for debate. And it's just what's so fascinating about this case, Ed. The more you kind of buy into one particular theory, then another part of the case doesn't make sense, which I'm sure is something you've, in your professional life, have come across a million times when you're investigating something. It's just that, and that's what kind of compels us, I think, to continue searching for the truth. But one thing's for certain, the official narrative doesn't ever mention those bullet holes in those vestibule doors, and it certainly doesn't mention the disparity with regards to what Mark Chapman thought he did and what the nurses and doctors saw back at the Roosevelt.
You know, it's amazing, too, because you'd think there would be 100 photos, 100 crime scene photos of just the bullet, you know, with rulers and tape measures and all kind, and the jackets, 100 pictures of the jackets. You'd think, right?
For sure. I mean, the only reason I know there's a bullet hole in the vestibule door that people can't see from the street and Mark Chapman couldn't see, the only reason I know there's a bullet hole in there is a guy I know from ITV, a producer called Kevin Sin, a really legendary ITV producer, did a fantastic documentary back in 1988 called The Man Who Shot John Lennon for ITV, and it was distributed all over the world. You can find it on YouTube. It's definitely one of the better Lennon murder documentaries. And I in that documentary were these kind of flash cuts of those vestibule doors, and I very slowly, you know, paused them and used slow-mo to see, and I realized that there were images in there that I've never seen before. So, of course, I got straight on the phone to Kevin Sin, and I said, Kevin, you know, it was a long time ago. Can you remember how you found that, and, you know, got hold of those images? And he said, yeah, I kind of vaguely do. He said, I think we got an insider at the time at the NYPD who supplied us with those images. He said, and we were very grateful, and we used them. And when we asked him again for some more stuff, someone must have got to me, he said, because very quickly he just kind of shut it all down and said, go away, I'm not going to talk to you again. But what's really heartbreaking is, and I've worked in film research and stills research, and, you know, I've worked in ITV. I know what the protocol was in the 80s, and sadly they didn't keep things like that. So you'd like to think that stuff like that would be archived away somewhere in a vault, but Kevin said it was all basically thrown away in the 90s, and, you know, those images are lost forever. But you can, if you use screen grabs on that documentary, you can clearly see, and I think I put it up on my Instagram, that one of those doors, the doors that was on the far side of the vestibule, on the far side of the driveway, does clearly have one bullet hole in it, and you can actually see the stairs to the right where John staggered up, allegedly, after he was shot. So thank goodness for Kevin and his insider at the NYPD, because what that then proves also, Ed, is that there were crime scene photos. Absolutely, because otherwise how would Kevin have got hold of them? So I think they took lots of photos, and I think we have to ask ourselves, why are they holding on to them? Why are they keen not to reveal more crime scene photos, especially when it comes, I get it when you don't want to reveal blood and gory stuff, but bullet holes aren't particularly gory, but they can tell a lot. They can tell a real story when you know where those bullet holes are, especially from a forensics point of view, but they're very keen not for those things to be revealed.
What about the trauma surgeons, the medical examiners? They should be able to determine whether or not a bullet was a full metal jacket or a hollow point?
Well, again, we're kind of, remember the two that we've got, the two different ones came from Elliot Gross's, you know, office. They came from the morgue, which obviously came from the autopsy. So that's all they've told us. So I don't think Elliot would have been given any other spent bullets. I'm not quite sure.
No, but what happened to the wounds, though? Examining the wounds is what I'm saying.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you examine the wounds, they should be able to tell. But
right.
What's interesting about that is the autopsy's never been released to the public on behalf of the privacy reasons for the family. Yoko doesn't want it to be released, which is fair enough, because It is a private medical record. I have read autopsies, I'm sure you have, Ed. They do go into every personal biological detail. So I'm not sure Yoko would want that sort of stuff to be put out there for the world to read. And to be honest with you, Ed, I'm not sure, even if it ever does get released, how much store I will put in it if it came from Elliot Gross and it has things like bullets stuck in John Lennon's neck. When I know I've spoken to, the doctors and nurses, and I should perhaps repeat this to people who are just listening to this podcast for the first time. When I spoke to Dr. Halloran, who actually was the real doctor who tried to treat John Lennon, not the doctors who lied about it for 30 years, he told me quite clearly that when he cut John Lennon's clothes off, he was assisted by nurses Deotra Sato and nurses Barbara Cameron. So they all got a good look when John initially came in. In fact, Barbara came slightly after. Dee was there and Dr. Halloran was there. First thing they did was they cut all John's clothes off and they turned him. This is, normal procedure. You turn his body, you look at the wounds on the front. You turn his body, look at the wounds on his back. They put him back on his back and they start working. They cut an incision. It's very important also to point out that the incision that they cut into John to massage his heart, which is something that they did after a while when they couldn't get a pulse, that incision, and I've got Dr. Halloran to confirm this to me, was kind of left chest, and it was nowhere near, that incision did not cut into the bullet holes that John had in his upper left chest. Because I'm sure a lot of people would think, well, maybe when they were operating on John and cutting his chest open, that would have kind of cut into the 4 entry wounds, and it would have got very confusing about what was an entry wound and what was an exit wound. But Dr. Halloran is absolutely unequivocal in the fact that that incision into John's chest to get to massage his heart, which is what he did, didn't affect the bullet holes in John's upper left chest. And what Dr. Halloran said, and the nurses said quite clearly, was that John had 4 entrance wounds. And remember, these are doctors and nurses who were very experienced at the time in an NYPD ER, so they in a New York ER department. So they've seen many gunshot wounds at that point in their career. So they knew how to assess an entrance and an exit. So they said there were 4 entrance wounds, upper left chest, in a tightly in a tight professional grouping, to use their phrasing, and 3 bullets came out of John's back in a direct line of fire the other way out. So none of them moved around. And the reason why we can be really certain of this is, not only did Dr. Halloran and the nurses say this when they were trying to save John's life, but nurses Camera and Sato were asked to take John's body. Once they called it and John was sadly, they couldn't save his life, they were the 2 people that were actually tasked to wash John's body and shroud it. So when they were doing this, the nurses sat him up and they said they got a clear look. John was basically naked, so they got a look at his whole body, and they said, yep, again, we could see 4 entrance wounds, upper left chest, 3 exit wounds, upper left back. But here's where it gets really creepy. Once they'd done that, and they shrouded him and they did their night's work and they were kind of, emotionally trying to recover, Elliot Gross, the chief medical officer, turns up unannounced. He comes into the ER and demands that the nurses unshroud John because he was in a real hurry to see John's wounds. Now, this apparently, according to these guys, never happened before this evening, this medical officer doing this, and they said it's never happened after that evening. It was just a completely one-off event, to the point where they both didn't actually think Elliot Gross was who he was saying he was, because they were like, well, why are you doing this? You're getting the body in a few hours to conduct the autopsy. Why on earth are you in such a hurry to see John's wounds? But he was in a real hurry to see them, and he absolutely demanded that they unshroud John, which they eventually did after much protest. They sat John up. John, it's going to be gory, but I have to say it, John started to bleed out from his 4 wounds in his upper left chest again. And all Elliot Gross did was he walked around the body very slowly, assessed the wounds, the 4 in the front, 3 out the back, and left, walked out, and headed off to the Dakota. We know he headed off to Dakota to assess the crime scene. And then the nurses had to re-wash John and re-shroud him. But what was good about this creepy visit from Elliot Gross was it gave the nurses yet another chance to see John's wounds up close. So they are adamant, and they literally to this day, Ed, cannot understand why the world keeps going with this myth that John was shot in the back. And there was a film done in 2016 called The Lennon Report, a dramatic film, not a particularly good film, to be honest, but, you know, the nurses and Dr. Halloran were kind of consultants on that film, which they were pleased about. And the film basically came out because another doctor, Stephen Lynn, for 30 years, claimed to be the doctor who saved John Lennon's life when he wasn't. That was Dr. Halloran. And Dr. Halloran came out in 2011 and said, no, Dr. Lynn's lying. I was the guy that massaged John's heart, and Dr. Lynn, thankfully, doesn't come up on TV much anymore. But the Lennon Report came out, but when they were kind of putting the film together, the nurses had many, many battles with the producers by saying, look, you can't put this in the script. You're saying in the script that he was shot in the back. John was shot in the front, because you can't get shot with 4 in the front and 3 coming out the back. You know, it's like the JFK thing. You can't be shot in the back from the front. And they had many, many arguments, they said, over many, many weeks. And there's a lovely classic line that one of the writers said to the nurses. He said, well, I'm just going by what Wikipedia is saying. You know, Wikipedia said he was shot in the back. And Barbara brilliantly retorted, well, Wikipedia wasn't in the room that night when we were trying to save John Lennon. So it's amazing that film, in the end, Wikipedia won out, and the nurses and doctor who was there, who could state unequivocally where John was shot, they still couldn't win the day, and the official narrative won over. And if you watch that film, they say in the film that, John's got some wounds in his back. So this is what you're up against. Even when you're trying to put a film together that gets to the truth of the matter of John's medical condition when he was brought into the Roosevelt, and you've got people on hand who are actually there telling you something different, the official narrative incredibly still wins out.
That's incredible. Now, you mentioned before tight professional grouping. Who wrote that? Who put that in the report?
That was the saying. That saying came from Dr. Halloran. Dr. Halloran said, he was the first one who told me that. He said that the shots were grouped together in a tight professional grouping. And when I said to Dr. Halloran that Mark Chapman was 20 feet behind John, and it was a kind of dark, dingy driveway when he was firing at him with a .38 cal revolver, I remember something Dr. Halloran said to me with great clarity, because it was one of the first conversations I ever had with him in 2020. He said that even if John turned around, which we know he didn't, and I can get into that in a minute, even if he did turn around and stand squarely looking at Mark Chapman to allow him to shoot his bullets, in this kind of tight professional grouping in John's upper left chest, he said in his opinion, and this was a very experienced surgeon, not even a Navy SEAL could pull off that kind of tight professional grouping above John's heart. He said it's just impossible, never alone a security guard, using a .38 revolver from that distance with not clear light. So now we're onto it, Ed. We might as well get to that point. It's really interesting. Wikipedia does state that John was shot 2 times in the back and 2 times in the shoulder. Now, that's morphed over the years from just shot in the back. So the 2 times in the shoulder is something that's been added in recent years. But they're still saying that he was shot in the back. Yet, if you listen to the NYPD and the DA's office, they often state, especially at the time of the murder, that John Lennon turned around. They said that Mark Chapman called out his name and John turned around. They said that a lot at the time. And in Wikipedia, to be fair to it, it does say that that's contested. And the reason why that's contested is it didn't happen. And the reason why we know it didn't happen and John didn't turn around is there's various reasons. Number one, Mark Chapman has never said in 42 years that he called out John's name. And in fact, in court, a few days when he was after the murder, when he was being asked to describe it, he said, no, I never called out John Lennon's name. Second point, which is really important, Yoko Ono, if you go to my Instagram account, Assassination of Lennon, you could see a page that I put up from Ron Hoffman's notebooks from an interview he had with Yoko Ono, one of the first interviews he had with Yoko Ono. And she states very clearly in that statement that they didn't turn around. So that's really important. So Yoko herself states that. Jay Hastings, the concierge, who had a window that was kind of facing out onto the driveway just behind the vestibule doors, which is where his concierge office was. Jay said he heard John's limo pull up, he heard the door open, he heard John's cowboy boots clicking along the driveway, which is a walk that he kind of got used to. So he go, oh, here comes the Lennons. He said he then heard the door open, the vestibule door open. Then he heard gunfire after the vestibule door was opened, which is why I believe John was shot inside the vestibule. It's one of the reasons why there's other evidence. And then, which is really strange, Jay then says he heard the bullets in the vestibule. He heard the glass crack in the vestibule after gunfire, not during gunfire. So potentially that was being done maybe by a silencer, maybe by a gun that had a silencer. But what Jay Hastings, getting back to my original point, what Jay Hastings says he didn't hear was Mark Chapman calling out to John Lennon to make him turn. There is one other witness, a taxi driver called Richard Peterson, who recently has said that he heard Mark Chapman call out to John Lennon when he started to shoot him. The problem with that is, though, I've interviewed Richard Peterson a couple of times. Richard Peterson has added that recently. If you go back to Richard Peterson's original statements, he never mentions hearing Mark Chapman call out to John Lennon. And Richard Peterson was actually sitting in a cab behind the Lennon's limousine when they pulled up, and he potentially didn't even have his windows down. So how he heard Mark Chapman calling out to John Lennon 25, 30 feet away in the Dakota driveway is hard to believe. So that's just a little bit extra that Richard Peterson has added. And I suspect Peterson heard it elsewhere, possibly from the DA's office, and he's just added that to his story. So I'm fairly convinced that John didn't turn around.
And it's amazing what time can do to your memory. You know, you can be convinced that you remember something that never happened. Yeah. You can, and people just add things, Ed. You know, I'm not going to say who, but I've had a witness. In fact, I might as well say it was Richard Peterson. And, you know, I was kind of talking to him about the case, and he was giving me, you know, basically Richard Peterson said he saw it all. He saw the whole thing. He didn't say he saw John get hit, by the way. So, again, we've had no one ever corroborate they saw John Lennon get hit, including Yoko Ono. But he did say that he saw Mark Chapman lurking with a gun and firing a gun, dropping the gun, taking his coat off, getting his book out, reading Catching the Rye, and then running off for help, and then running back. Richard Peterson had a front row seat to the whole thing. It sounds like he was just sitting there in his cab with some popcorn. Yeah. I think Peterson heard and saw things, for sure. The problem with Richard Peterson's statement, though, is there's quite a few people who've said that immediately after gunfire, they looked out of their windows or they saw the street scene and they saw a yellow taxi fly off down the road really fast. I think that was Richard Peterson. And I think what he did was he parked his taxi somewhere down the road and then came back and picked up from witnesses and the doorman what went down and inserted himself a little bit more into history than he deserves to be. But I can only allege that I don't know that for sure. Maybe he did see everything. Who knows? But his statement was a little bit too. It was a little bit too full. It was a little bit too detailed. And getting back to the point I was saying to you about people embellishing, when I said to him, this is something he's never said before, did John and Mark exchange a look, or was there some kind of glance? He said, oh, actually, now if you come to think of it, he said, yeah. He said, I think John nodded at Mark and Mark nodded at John. He's never said that before. Mark's never said that before. And I think he was just basically adding that just to kind of, again, build more stuff into his recollections that were probably really there. So you, again, Ed, you know this in your profession. It's so hard to kind of differentiate between real testimony and kind of fake memories that you pick up from other testimony across over the years, and then you add that to your own recollections, and I think that's gone on an awful lot in the John Lennon murder. Yeah, plus a high-profile story like this, you're being interviewed all the time. You say, boy, I'm running out of things to say. Let me come up. I got to make myself relevant and interesting. Real quick, though, because I say we go over so much stuff, but another thing about witnesses, did you come across any witnesses that appeared that perhaps they came into a windfall of money or some opportunities that could have colored their testimony?
That's a good question. No, it's hard. I mean, it's a good segue actually into who the real witnesses were, and I think it's useful to actually list them. There wasn't that many. Many came after the fact. There's a witness called Sean Strube, who sort of turned up, I would say, 2 minutes after hearing gunfire, maybe 90 seconds after hearing gunfire. And he saw the doorman, he saw Chapman. About a minute later, he saw 3 minutes later, he saw some cops carrying Lennon's body out. But Strube actually didn't see anything at all. But yet, on the night of the murder, the news teams that were covering it pretty much only exclusively spoke to Sean Strube, which is bizarre because there was a doorman there called Jose Padermo who should have seen everything. But yet, Jose Padermo was never interviewed by any news crew or journalist, and of course his name was concealed for 7 years. And his testimony to this day, Ed, is still concealed. So the doorman and what he saw, Jose Padermo, is very, very interesting and mysterious. And I've spoken to the DA's office, I've spoken to Kim Holgreth. He did confirm to me that Jose Padermo was obviously interviewed as a witness of great interest. But why they're concealing his testimony to this day is still a mystery. And I think the reason they're concealing it is I don't think Padermo saw much at all. I think he went back to his gold booth after letting the Lennons out of their car. I think he heard gunfire. I think he came back into the driveway. One interesting thing that Padermo did say to Officer Cullen, who was one of the first, there was 2 officers that basically arrived together at the scene for the first time. The first 2 policemen on the scene were Officers Spiro, who arrested Chapman and handcuffed him and put him up against the wall, and Officer Cullen, who ran into the vestibule and up into the lobby and said he saw John bleeding out. And then he came back out and said to Spiro, this is a real thing, someone's been shot in here, make sure you keep that guy handcuffed. But there's 2 interesting things here that Cullen said that have never really been picked up on, and they should be. The first thing Officer Cullen said when he got there was a guy, an unidentified member of the public, is what Cullen called him, running out of the driveway saying, someone's shooting a gun in there. Now, who the hell was that? Because that could easily have been a second shooter. Why Cullen didn't tell that guy to stand there and get his name and address, or why to this day he's not bothered who that man is beyond me. But then Cullen said something even more interesting. He said that the doorman told him that the bullets pushed John through the doors. Now, what he means by that is I think the vestibule doors pull out into the driveway. So if the bullets that hit John pushed him through those doors, they could only have been shot inside the vestibule, not outside where Mark Chapman was. So I think that was a really telling little detail that Padermo revealed to Officer Cullen on the ground. It's, again, one of those really interesting details just been glossed over. So the doorman should have seen everything. Maybe one day we'll see his testimony, maybe one day we won't. Yoko Ono, of course, another witness who was there, her testimony is very troubling. I've stated many times that I don't think she was involved in her husband's murder. That said, there is an awful lot of questions we still need to ask about Yoko Ono. And the problem with Yoko is she gave 5 statements in a 3-day period after the murder. 2 on the night, 1 the next day, and 2 in the days that followed. The problem with her testimony is, Ed, is the first thing she says is the official narrative. She got out first, she walked ahead, and then John got out and he walked behind her, and that's something that Chapman has confirmed. She then said that John got out first in her next statement, and she was behind John, which is troubling, because you think at that point she'd have perhaps got in the way of Chapman's bullets, or she would have seen Mark Chapman shoot John Lennon. And it's really important to state that in 42 years, Yoko Ono has never said she saw Mark Chapman shoot her husband. So that's really a really important detail. She's had many opportunities to do so. I don't think she did see it. And if she was behind John and behind Chapman, surely she'd have seen this happening. So I don't think that's correct. So I don't know why she said that. And then in another statement, she said that she was sometimes ahead of John and John was sometimes ahead of her, and they kind of swapped positions, which again I don't quite buy, because I don't think the driveway was long enough for that to happen. But if you talk to Ron Hoffman, the lead detective, he's convinced that John was ahead.
Did you get shot? Did you get shot there, David?
Hang on. I've lost you there, mate.
No,
Can you hear me? I've lost you there.
I'm here.
Lost sound there.
I'm here.
Okay.
No, we're good.
Yeah. How am I sounding?
You're sounding great.
Okay?
You're sounding great, yeah. We only got about 3 minutes left, though.
Yeah, so let me get back to that. So basically, let's just finish up here, Ed. So basically, he said that Yoko was behind John, John was ahead, and Mark Chapman stood between Yoko and John. and shot John in the back. Now, I just can't believe that's true because, as I say, Yoko did not ever say she saw Mark Chapman shoot her husband, so she could not have been behind Mark Chapman, otherwise she'd have said she saw that. Now, another witness, there were two other witnesses. There was the concierge, Jay Hastings, who was an audio witness. He heard things going on, but he didn't actually see the shooting. And there was another witness, a lift operator called Joseph Manny, who I know one of your previous guests thinks is the shooter, who came out of the alcove lift elevator area opposite the vestibule doors. And Joe Manny was downstairs in the basement. He heard gunfire. He said he heard 3 shots, not 4, not 5. He said he heard 3 shots. He came up into the driveway area with 2 co-workers, Joe Grezik and Victor Cruz. And when he got there, he saw Jose Padermo walking around a gun at the back of the driveway. Chapman was at the front by the street reading Capturing the Rye, and he said Padermo was pacing up and down next to the gun, or a gun. No actual evidence or proof that gun was Chapman's, but Padermo was walking around that gun, and he said to Joe Manny famously, pick that gun up, take it downstairs and hide it so this guy can't use it. Mm-hmm. So Joe did that. But you've got to ask yourselves the question here. The legend is that Padermo kicked that gun to the back of the driveway after Mark Chapman allegedly used it. And amazingly, one of Richard Peterson's passengers, Franklin Welsh, says he saw Jose Padermo do this. Not quite sure how he could see that from where he was in the taxi, but we'll go with it. But you've got to ask yourself the question, Ed. Why didn't Jose pick that gun up himself? Why did he kick it to the back of the driveway? And why did he wait for someone else to come up to pick it up and take it away? Surely